Episode 1 Early summer. The soft sunshine filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, lazily filling the room with a feeling of incredible comfort and ease. However, Eve, sitting by the window, found the light blinding, so much so that his eyes ached, almost making him cry. Just a moment ago, Natalie Young said she was getting married. The person was Luke Quinn. He had never imagined that the boy, 2 years older than him, who had always been there to protect him, would one day marry a girl other than him. Even more unexpected was that this girl was none other than his university roommate, Natalie Young. What kind of person is Natalie Young? She's the famous butterfly of the university, always looking for something better, never knowing how many sincere hearts she's toyed with. How could Luke Quinn fall for her? When did they get together? As the person who introduced them, he had no clue. Sophia White took the lemon water in front of her, took a sip, her eyes curved into a smile, and looked at the beautiful and alluring girl opposite her. Really? Well, then congratulations to both of you. Eve, being able to receive your blessing makes me so relieved, Natalie Young said, pausing hesitantly, looking at him apologetically. Sorry. I really didn't expect Luke to like me. You know, he's handsome and so excellent, I couldn't possibly refuse. All of Natalie Young's words boiled down to one thing: you like Luke Quinn. But the person Luke Quinn loves is me. It was clearly sarcastic, yet he spoke with a humble tone, hiding the truth within, piercing him so deeply that he bled, but he couldn't utter a single word of blame. Suppressing all the bitterness inside, he tried to force a smile. Oh, why are you apologizing to me? Everyone has the right to pursue love. Besides, I liked Luke Quinn, but that was all in school days. So, you mean you don't like Luke anymore? Natalie Young looked at Eve in shock, obviously not believing him. Like? Why wouldn't I like him? He never denied his feelings for Luke. But to avoid making himself look too pathetic, he told a little lie: but I've already found true love. That feeling is completely different from just liking. If I don't see him for a day, I feel like I'm not okay at all. Clearly, Eve wasn't a good actor. His facial expression was overly exaggerated when he lied. Humph, stop pretending. Your acting is awful. Natalie Young couldn't help but sneer at him disdainfully. Exposed on the spot, Eve was so ashamed that he wished he could find a hole to hide in. But he didn't allow himself to retreat, determined to continue his performance despite the embarrassment. What? You don't believe me? Do you think I would? Natalie Young retorted. I'm telling the truth. Seeing that Natalie Young still looked unconvinced, Eve became anxious. If you don't believe me, I'll call him right now for you to meet. Natalie Young didn't give Eve a chance to back down. Fine, let me see what kind of man he is. To make you fall in love with someone else. After saying that, Natalie Young lazily leaned back on the chair, her eyes glancing at him with a mocking look, clearly waiting to see how he would explain himself. Her lips curled uncontrollably into a smile full of challenge. Eve hated himself so much for this uncooperative mouth of his. Now, where was he supposed to find a boyfriend on the spot? Under Natalie Young's watchful gaze, Eve had no choice but to pull out his phone and dial a number. The call was quickly connected, and before the person on the other end could say anything, a gentle, affectionate voice echoed, "Darling, what are you doing? When you're done, come pick me up. By the way, I'll introduce you to a friend." Without giving the other party time to react, Eve swiftly ended the call and sent over the address, adding one more line: "Rent a rich guy to come save me." Putting away his phone, Eve forced himself to calm down. After managing to steady his emotions, he smiled faintly at Natalie Young across from him. Perhaps Natalie Young knew his little trick, but instead of exposing him, she simply smirked with disdain. This wasn't the time to add salt to the wound, she just needed to sit back and enjoy the show, and later, she'd mock Eve smugly. A few seconds passed, but to him, it felt like a century. Natalie Young picked up the juice on the table, sipping it slowly while teasing, when is your boyfriend coming? Should we wait a bit more with this juice? The face in front of him was clearly smiling, but it suffocated Eve, leaving him speechless. He kept glancing at the door, gripping his phone tightly. Eve silently prayed in his heart, hoping that the person arriving would be a tall, handsome, and strong man. Otherwise, it would be hard to impress Natalie Young. He no longer paid attention to Natalie Young's smug, mocking smile. Alright, his expectations weren't high anymore. Now, he only hoped that the person Emily Palmer had arranged would appear at the door soon. As long as it's a man, that's enough. Natalie Young followed Eve's gaze toward the door, but there was no one there. Her smile grew wider. Maybe I'll order another juice. Eve, do you want to order one for your boyfriend too? Eve ignored Natalie Young's sarcastic tone. No need. He doesn't like juice. Since he had already lied, embellishing that lie a bit more wouldn't hurt. The new juice arrived, and just as the waiter bent down to place the glass, Eve noticed a man standing by the door. He was dressed in a suit, standing tall, appearing to be at least 1.8 meters. Eve guessed that this must be the boyfriend Emily Palmer had rented for him. The anxiety on his face disappeared instantly. He stood up from his seat, filled with joy. My boyfriend is here. You stay here for a moment, I'll go get him at the door. Before Natalie Young could say anything, Eve had already dashed towards the door. When he reached outside, he glanced back and saw Natalie Young looking in his direction. He thought to himself that he couldn't stay outside too long. Natalie Young was smart. If he stayed too long, she'd figure it out. Just as the man pushed the door open, Eve took a step forward, quickly opened the door, and warmly greeted the person outside, as if the two were old friends. To be more specific, they looked like a couple in love. Under the confused gaze of the man, he looked at the woman who greeted him, and a sense of mistaken identity flashed through his mind. Did he have such an ordinary face? Why didn't he know that? Regardless of how the man in front of him looked at him, he only knew that there was now a spreading fire that needed to be extinguished immediately, with no time to engage in any verbal exchange with this man. He quickly grabbed his wrist, his tone neither loud nor soft, just enough for the two of them to hear. Follow me, it's urgent. In a bit, you don't need to say anything, I'll handle it. Got it? Just act like a mute that can move, that's all. Okay, the man looked at him with disgust, pulling his hand away. He understood what was being said but couldn't figure out what this person was planning. Eve pulled the man to stand by the table. Natalie Young's gaze shifted between the two several times, and there wasn't even the slightest sign that they were a couple. To say that this tall, handsome, and imposing man was Eve's boyfriend? She wouldn't believe it, not even if her life depended on it. Natalie Young stood up with enthusiasm. Eve, is this your boyfriend? Yes, he just finished his work, and there was traffic on the way, so he arrived late. Then why are you still standing there like a fool? Tell your boyfriend to sit down. Are you two comparing heights? Whose clothes did you hang out to dry? Immediately, Eve pulled the man to sit down. Eve's expression was somewhat panicked, but fortunately, she kept holding onto the man's arm. However, her actions and expressions gave Natalie Young a very deliberate feeling. If one had to say, this man was certainly just a supporting actor that Eve brought from somewhere to play a role. As a good friend, she felt the need to ask properly. Faced with such a handsome man, Natalie Young's tone remained gentle, despite her usual attitude. Hello, I'm Natalie Young. Eve, really? You got a boyfriend and didn't tell me? We always thought you were single. How long have you two been together? The last question was what Natalie Young truly wanted to ask. Knowing that Natalie Young would definitely press with more difficult questions, Eve subtly tightened her grip on the man's hand, as she hadn't had time to explain the details to him yet. Of course, only she could answer these questions. Without leaving any trace, she gripped his hand a little tighter. The man had already figured out part of the situation. His deep eyes, calm and unwavering, gazed at the smiling girl holding onto him. Eve leaned her head gently on his shoulder, like a bird nestled in, sweetly saying, "Almost a year now, right, darling? You're such a jerk. I've told you so many times to remember our anniversary, but you always forget. Every time I have to remind you. If you forget next time, I'm going to punch you." Ethan Parker watched her mischievous and playful act, and a faint smile appeared on his lips, barely able to suppress a laugh. This girl was quite interesting. To make Natalie Young believe that they were truly a couple deeply in love for a year, she went all out. Just looking at the fact that this rented man had a decent appearance, Eve reluctantly decided to take a small loss. He grabbed the juice on the table and took a big gulp. This performance had not only left him with a dry throat but also forced his brain to operate at full speed to handle Natalie Young's upcoming odd questions. Seeing Natalie Young's amused expression, she sneered, her eyes full of mockery, "Go ahead, keep pretending." Just as she was about to speak and continue the deep conversation with the man, the phone in her bag started vibrating non-stop. Reluctantly, she stood up and left to answer the call. As she left, Natalie Young threw a flirty wink at Eve, as if to say, "I'll be back to interrogate you later." With Natalie Young gone, Eve let out a sigh of relief, immediately letting go of the man's hand. He still couldn't shake off the look Natalie Young gave as she left, and it made him slightly uncomfortable. He liked Natalie Young, but that didn't mean she could use such a condescending attitude to look down on him. He wasn't going to let it slide, he had to fight back a little. Without giving the man a chance to speak, Eve rattled off, "You think this is funny, don't you? I can't explain anything to you right now. You just need to follow what I say. If you manage to fool her, your job is done. Don't worry, I'll pay you extra. Also, when she comes back, you need to hug me proactively. Do some intimate actions as well, don't let her see that I'm the one instructing you. Got it?" The man raised his eyebrow, his eyes calm and tranquil like still water. Eve leaned back in the chair with calm composure, looking at the nervous girl. A faint smile subtly appeared at the corners of his lips. However, with Eve's usual coarse demeanor, she couldn't detect his slight expression. Inside, she was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan, running around aimlessly. If this man had given any reaction, it would have been fine, but there was none, he might as well have been mute or paralyzed. If this task gets messed up, I won't give you a penny, she thought. It's up to you. Remember what I just told you. She was about to add more, but then she saw Natalie Young, who had just finished her phone call and was walking over. Eve immediately shut her mouth and snuggled into the man's arms, softly asking, "Darling, what would you like to drink? Let me order it for you." As Natalie Young sat down, the man's hand brushed past Eve's waist, gently holding her. He turned his head and smiled at her, a smile that nearly entranced Eve. His smile was warm and sincere, bright like the rising sun in hell, radiant but not blinding, making it hard for one to resist forgetting the worries inside. The entire scene played out in Natalie Young's eyes. Though her smile remained, there was something indescribable in her gaze. Yet, a hint of envy was evident. After sitting down, Natalie Young tidied her long hair and, with a shy yet deliberate air, said, "My husband is the same, we barely part for a little while, and he's already saying he misses me. I must have made you laugh." Then she asked, "By the way, what does your boyfriend do? Tell me, he seems quite impressive." Natalie Young casually asked a question, which left Eve momentarily stunned. Her brain quickly filtered through possible responses, and after a brief second, she finally came up with a reasonable explanation. But before she could speak, the man next to her answered a second earlier, "Jingsheng, not sure if Miss Yao has heard of it." "Jingsheng? Are you talking about Jingsheng International, the famous company?" Natalie Young was slightly taken aback. She had applied to this company before, but her resume had been rejected within a few days. To this day, it remained a sore point in her heart. Of course, who in Jiang Charles doesn't know Jingsheng International, Eve, it seems your boyfriend is doing quite well. What does he do there? Which department? Is he a manager or just a low-level employee? Eve rolled her eyes helplessly. Is it fun to dig so deep? Natalie Young, are you really that bored? The man gazed at Eve intently, clearly in no rush to answer Natalie Young's questions. He reached over to take the juice on the table and gently brought it to Eve's lips. His tender gaze was full of obvious affection. Wow, this guy is acting so well, I'll definitely give him extra money later, Eve thought, feeling embarrassed as she took the straw in her mouth. The man then calmly responded, not a manager, and not a low-level employee either. That's easy to guess, Natalie Young thought to herself. If he had a better position, would he really choose someone like Eve? Seems like he's not much, just a pretty face. Natalie Young continued to probe, could he be just a clerk in the company? At this point, Eve couldn't take it anymore. What's wrong with being a clerk? At least it's an honest job, isn't it? She tightly gripped the man's hand beside her. Natalie Young, don't go too far. If you keep pushing your luck, Eve, I'll definitely teach you a good lesson. The man smiled gently, tightening his hold on the girl beside him, speaking in a calm and polite tone, to be honest, Jingsheng belongs to my family. As soon as those words left his mouth, before Natalie Young could react, Eve choked on the juice, coughing violently until tears streamed down her face. Oh my God, lying is fine, but don't tell such a big lie. If the bluff is too big, it'll crush you when it falls. He could have said any small position, but he had to go and claim he's the president of the group. You always manage to choke on something, don't you? Ethan Parker, like a perfect gentleman, promptly handed her a tissue and gently patted her back, his actions so natural that it gave the illusion that he was truly her boyfriend. Opposite them, Natalie Young was equally shocked by his words, left speechless for a long moment, doubting whether she had misheard or was experiencing auditory hallucinations. She widened her eyes and asked in disbelief, "Are you really the president of Jingsheng International, Ethan Parker?" Ethan Parker nodded with a hum, continuing to pat Eve's back to help her recover. Meanwhile, Eve was still racking her brain, trying to figure out how to maintain this lie. Across from them, Natalie Young seemed like she had taken a shot of adrenaline, eagerly calling out Eve's name. Eve, you really have some skills. Who would have thought, in such a short time, you'd land such a dark horse, the president of Jingsheng International. Your luck is incredible. Is that a compliment or an insult? Eve, feeling overwhelmed by Natalie Young's sudden enthusiasm, could only smile helplessly in response. In Eve's heart, a wave of disappointment surged, like tens of thousands of wild llamas running through, making her too scared to even breathe deeply. Facing this outrageous lie, what else could she do besides nodding? Natalie Young hadn't stopped talking, continuously bombarding her with all sorts of questions. In the end, Eve could clearly sense the strong envy and slight jealousy in Natalie Young's tone. This meant, it seemed like she had won this battle. Blushing with embarrassment, Eve shyly said, "It's nothing special, just happened to meet by chance." It's fate, I guess." Speaking of fate, her heart couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. It seemed that there really was no fate between her and Luke Quinn. Natalie Young was also feeling bitter inside, thinking that today she came to see Eve make a fool of herself, but ended up being the one who was embarrassed. This was a truly ironic situation. Natalie Young was great at finding faults in even the smallest things, and now she was nitpicking a non-existent flaw, her voice dripping with sourness. But no matter how I look at you two, you just don't seem like a couple. When he brought you in earlier, I thought you had brought your uncle along. If you want to call someone old, just say it directly. Going around in circles like that, don't you find it rude? Eve thought, but knowing Natalie Young's personality, rudeness was nothing new. Eve just treated those words like garbage on the street, picked them up and tossed them into the trash can. Eve continued smiling, feeling her cheeks ache from holding the smile for so long. She raised her hands and wrapped them around the man's waist, pressing her cheek against his firm chest, her face full of the gentle affection of a young woman. I just like men with maturity and sophistication. Natalie Young, don't you think the age difference is kind of cute? I didn't really understand myself before. After meeting him, I realized how poor my judgment was before. Sorry, what Luke Quinn said earlier wasn't true. Eve apologized sincerely in her heart. She didn't like to mock others, except for Natalie Young. If she didn't step on her tail a little, she'd probably be soaring up to the heavens by now. But Eve reminded herself, after all, Luke Quinn was someone I liked, so don't always end up hurting yourself. Natalie Young's words felt like a hard slap across Eve's face, leaving her speechless. The man beside her smiled gently, like a breeze lightly brushing across Eve's flushed cheeks. He tenderly tapped her nose, and in his eyes, she could see a miniature version of herself reflected. Eve looked up, and it seemed like she could see the word affection in his gaze. She reaffirmed in her heart, later, I'll definitely pay him extra, double the amount. Ethan Parker's small, charming eyes were too mesmerizing. If she had met him before Luke Quinn, half of her soul would have been stolen away. Eve, I really liked hearing those words you just said. Those simple 3 words left Natalie Young speechless. When she saw such a heartfelt scene, what reason did she have to doubt that the two weren't a real couple? Natalie Young felt a bit annoyed inside, but she wore a fake smile on her face. She couldn't understand why good things and good people always came to Eve, both in the past and now. Why her? As she left, Natalie Young wore a flattering smile, saying many words of blessing, though laced with hidden barbs. Después de conocerlo, me di cuenta de lo mala que era mi percepción antes. Lo siento, lo que Luke Quinn dijo antes no era verdad. Eve se disculpó sinceramente en su corazón. No le gustaba burlarse de los demás, excepto de Natalie Young. Si no le pasaba un poco la cola, probablemente ya estaría flotando por los cielos. Pero Eve se recordó a sí misma, después de todo, Luke Quinn fue alguien a quien le gust, así que no siempre termines hiriéndote. Las palabras de Natalie Young fueron como una bofetada en la cara de Eve, dejándola sin palabras. El hombre a su lado sonrió suavemente, como una brisa que rozaba ligeramente las mejillas aclaradas de Eve. El lo dio un suave toque en la nariz, y en sus ojos, ella pudo ver una versión miniatura de sí misma reflejada. Eve miró hacia arriba y parecía que podía ver la palabra afecto en su mirada. Se reafirmó en su corazón, más tarde, definitivamente lo pegar más, el doble. Los pequeños ojos encantadores de Ethan Parker eran demasiado atractivos, si lo hubiera conocido antes que a Luke Quinn, seguramente la mitad de su alma ya habría sido robada. Eve, realmente me gustaron esas palabras que dijiste. Esas simples 3 palabras dejaron a Natalie Young sin palabras. Al ver una escena tan sentimental, ¿qué motivo tenía para no creer que los dos eran una pareja real? Natalie Young se sintió un poco molesta por dentro, pero en su rostro mantenía una sonrisa falsa. No podía entender por qué las cosas buenas y las personas buenas siempre llegaban a Eve, tanto antes como ahora. ¿Por qué ella? Al irse, Natalie Young mostró una sonrisa halagadora, diciendo muchas palabras de bendición, aunque llenas de espinas ocultas. Natalie Young brought up Eve's past relationships and finally asked Ethan Parker for a business card. Ethan Parker smiled politely, looking toward Natalie Young, and this action made Natalie Young secretly pleased. However, what Ethan Parker said next to Eve left her feeling awkward and afraid. What should I do? Ethan Parker asked, Miss Yao is asking for my business card. Should I give it to her or not? Eve, who had been ready to mentally celebrate, bit her lip to stop herself from laughing when she heard this. After holding back the urge to laugh, she said seriously, Natalie Young, my boyfriend just arrived, so he didn't bring any business cards. How about this, next time we meet, I'll give it to you, okay? Whenever Natalie Young got angry, she liked to frown, and now Eve found that Natalie Young looked most beautiful when she was like this. As she left, Natalie Young gritted her teeth and said, "Goodbye." Eve tried not to laugh too openly, while a little voice in her head kept repeating the phrase. Raising her right hand with a deliberately dramatic expression, Eve said, "Goodbye." But internally, she added, "Humph, hopefully never again." After watching Natalie Young get into the car and leave, Eve quickly removed her hand from Ethan Parker's waist, stood up, and patted his shoulder. With such a stellar performance, she could only say two words, amazing. Ethan Parker calmly looked at the girl in front of him, waiting to see how she would repay this favor. Eve, who had managed to maintain her composure, suddenly felt her emotions deflate, sinking like a wilted eggplant. I can't cry just yet, there's still one more thing to handle." Eve turned around and took a serious look at the man sitting on the seat. She had been so focused on how to deal with Natalie Young earlier that she hadn't really paid attention to this man. To her surprise, this man had an exceptionally good appearance, especially those deep, dark eyes like a bottomless pool that made it hard to look away. If she had known earlier, she would have taken more advantage during the act. After all, she paid for it, so why not? Thinking about it, she felt that such a flawless appearance was wasted on a job like this. "Had enough of looking, miss?" Eve immediately turned her head away, a faint blush appearing on her face. She couldn't help but think, all right, stop acting. Do you really think you're a CEO? So cool. Ethan Parker noticed her change in expression and thought back to the hug she had given him earlier. A strange feeling began to spread from deep inside him, not too strong, but just enough to make him feel a little ticklish in his heart. This girl wasn't exactly beautiful, but her natural, unadorned face and casual sportswear gave her a fresh and unique look that could catch anyone's eye. As Eve looked back at him, she once again felt grateful to Emily Palmer for introducing this man. In terms of height, looks, and manners, he surpassed Luke Quinn in every way. But, as they say, everyone has their preferences, and she still preferred Luke Quinn's type, a love that had penetrated her very bones. Seeing that he still hadn't left and showed no sign of doing so, Eve suddenly remembered that she hadn't paid him yet. She quickly pulled out her wallet. Eve pulled out 2 red banknotes from her wallet and said, "You've worked hard today. This is what you deserve. If I encounter this situation again, I'll come to you. You did a fantastic job." Excitedly, she stuffed the money into Ethan Parker's suit pocket, and after doing so, she kindly patted it and smiled, "This suit is nice, better return it quickly, or you'll have to pay extra rental fees for keeping it longer." Ethan Parker glanced at the corner of the red RMB sticking out of his pocket, his sharp brows furrowed, and his deep, brooding eyes slowly shifted to the carefree smile on the girl's face. He stared intently at her, wondering, what does she take me for, using money to brush me off like this? Eve, thinking he was upset because the amount she gave him was too small, noticed his resentful gaze and thought he was dissatisfied. Not wanting to argue over money, she opened her wallet, pulled out another 50 yuan note, and handed it to him. 200 yuan is the going rate, and this 50 yuan is a bonus for your excellent performance today. Consider it taxi fare, so you won't have to take the bus and risk wrinkling that high-end suit. Eve thought that someone like him must be thrilled to have a client like her. Ethan Parker took out the 200 yuan Eve had just given him, along with the 50 yuan in his other hand. The storm clouds in his heart grew thicker. By the time he looked up, the girl had already rushed off in a hurry. Ethan Parker watched Eve's figure as she walked more than 10 meters away, his thin lips curving into a meaningful smile. It wasn't until her figure disappeared into the crowd that he finally withdrew his gaze. He tucked the 250 yuan he earned into his pocket, then pulled out his car keys and walked toward the Bentley parked by the roadside. Just as he opened the car door, his phone rang. Glancing at the caller ID, he couldn't help but frown before answering the call. "Yeah, I didn't go. Something came up at the company. Alright, I'll hang up now." He ended the call and got into the car. Meanwhile, Eve headed straight to Emily Palmer's hair salon. She owned a small share of the salon and had been involved in the interior design. Many of the creative decoration ideas were hers. Every time she saw the stylish, high-end hair salon, she would proudly grab Emily Palmer and say, if it weren't for my sharp eye, could you have created such a warm and elegant hair salon? Could you?" Emily Palmer would usually roll her eyes and reply disdainfully, "If you're so good, why don't you make another one? You always like to praise yourself. You can't go a day without stroking your ego 3 or 4 times, right? The biggest design flaw in this salon is thanks to you, but I didn't even bother to tell you." Eve and Emily Palmer's passionate and secretive relationship started at this very salon. Initially, Emily Palmer was just one of her many students. The two were the same age, and their personalities clicked. Not long after, they became close friends who could talk about anything. Later, when a store below their gym was transferred, Emily Palmer suggested renting it to open a hair salon and asked Eve to invest. At that time, Eve had only been working for less than a year and had no savings. But Emily Palmer said she wasn't interested in her money, but rather the customer base she had. As long as Eve could introduce gym members to the salon for membership, she would get a share of the profits. She also said that if Eve could refer salon customers to the gym, they could maximize their profits together. Eve agreed purely because of that last sentence. But now, almost a year since the hair salon opened, the number of members she had referred could be counted on one hand. Meanwhile, almost all the salon customers were gym members. Fortunately, Eve still received a considerable commission each month, so she didn't press the matter. In the afternoon, there were only 2 or 3 customers at the salon. The owner, Emily Palmer, was curled up on the sofa playing with her iPad. Eve walked over, tossed her bag aside, and flopped onto the adjacent sofa, sinking deep into the cushions. Her eyes were glued to the ceiling, seemingly deep in thought. Sensing something was off with Eve, Emily Palmer, who had been happily playing her game, paused it and threw the iPad aside. She leaned over and asked, "So, did you two fight? Looking at your sorry state, you must have lost badly. I told you, you shouldn't have gone to see him. It was obviously just to show you how happy he is now. And then he'll see how pathetic you are. Only a fool like you would run over there just like that. What kind of person does this? Who kicks someone when they're down and adds fuel to the fire?" Eve helplessly looked at Emily Palmer and motioned with her middle finger for her to come closer. Emily Palmer, catching the signal, squatted down by the sofa with a face full of anticipation, eager to hear the fresh gossip. Eve smiled and gave Emily Palmer's chubby cheeks a big kiss before bursting into laughter. "Not bad at all, this time everything worked perfectly. You have no idea how angry I made Natalie Young. I bet when she gets home, she won't be able to eat or sleep for days. Every time I think about the look on her face when I got the best of her, I can't help but laugh. I've been holding it in the whole way here, I'm about to explode from holding it in." Eve laughed so hard that she nearly passed out on the sofa countless times. Meanwhile, Emily Palmer, watching her from the side, couldn't stand it any longer. She patted Eve on the shoulder with sympathy, saying, "This girl must have been seriously provoked by Natalie Young, which is why she's acting so hysterical right now." Emily Palmer then said with pity, "Sweetie, stop forcing that smile. I know you're upset about hearing that Luke Quinn is getting married. There aren't many customers in the shop right now, so why don't you just vent your anger and curse Natalie Young out? If you want, I'll curse her with you. You know I'm pretty good at it." "Curse her for what?" Eve chuckled, "Isn't my laughing to tears already enough to say it all?" Eve coughed lightly, trying to stop her hearty laughter. Eve sat up from the sofa and pulled Emily Palmer to sit down next to her. Once Emily Palmer was seated, she leaned her head on her shoulder, playing with her long hair, and said happily, "The guy you found for me today was really great. He handled everything so well. When I saw him, I was worried if he could deal with Natalie Young, but he pulled it off perfectly. Now that I think about it, the 250 yuan was totally worth it, at least I regained my dignity. You finally did something right. Come on, to thank you, I'll give you a loving hug." Before Emily Palmer could catch on to what was happening, Eve had already hugged her tightly. The hug left Emily Palmer confused, not knowing what was going on. Pulling back the still excited Eve, Emily Palmer calmly asked, "What guy? I've been busy all afternoon, where did I have the time to find you a guy? You must be mistaken." Eve froze for a second before quickly shaking her hand in denial. "Don't joke with me. Do you think you're Lei Feng, doing good deeds without leaving your name? I sent you a message, didn't I?" Emily Palmer, still puzzled, seemed to find the key to the misunderstanding and said helplessly, "Yes, I received your message, but I didn't find any guy for you, I'm absolutely sure of that." Before Emily Palmer could finish her sentence, Eve suddenly stood up from the sofa, recalling the events of the day. From when she brought the man in to when Kevin Liu left, it struck her that the man had never mentioned being introduced by anyone. The phrase, "I was rented," made Eve realize she had made a big mistake. Luckily, she didn't know the man personally. Emily Palmer pulled Eve, who was standing, down to sit and whispered in her ear, "No matter how the process went, the result is what matters most. And the result now is that you've won big." Thinking about the happy outcome, Eve no longer felt any guilt. Her confused actions today, after all, were paid for. Leaving the hair salon, Eve returned home. As soon as she opened the door, she encountered her mother, James Zhou, coming out of the Kit Charles. Seeing her mother carrying a lunch box, Eve knew it was for Aunt Linda. She stepped forward, took the lunch box from her mother's hand, and gently held her mother's rough, weathered hand, smiling sweetly, "Mom, is this for Aunt Linda?" James Zhou nodded, reaching up to tidy Eve's messy hair, a loving smile on her face. She had worked hard for half her life, and seeing her obedient and considerate daughter filled her heart with an indescribable sense of satisfaction and comfort. "Eve, I still have to prepare the vegetables to sell tomorrow. You take this food to Aunt Linda and come back quickly for dinner." But taking the food over meant Eve would surely meet Luke Quinn, and what should she say to him then? Eve hesitated, glancing at her mother, but her mother didn't notice her expression, already turning back to her tasks. Watching her mother crouched in the cramped Kit Charles, Eve couldn't bring herself to say no. Her mother had been busy all day, she couldn't be so inconsiderate. "Mom, I'll go take the food to Aunt Linda now. Wait for me, we'll have dinner together." James Zhou peeked out from the Kit Charles, smiled at Eve, and said, "Go quickly, but don't come back too late." Both her mother and Aunt Linda were kind-hearted people. Eve and Luke Quinn were both children without fathers. When they were younger, their families lived close to each other, and they often helped each other out, maintaining a harmonious relationship. Luke Quinn's father was a police officer who died in the line of duty. Later, the police department provided them with a new apartment, and even after they moved, they stayed in touch with Eve's family. Whenever Aunt Linda cooked something delicious, she would send Luke Quinn to school with some for Eve, and her mother did the same. At the hospital, Eve made her way to Aunt Linda's room with ease. Though she was delivering food as usual, today's mood was entirely different from the past few days. Looking through the window, she saw that only. Aunt Linda was inside, and she quietly breathed a sigh of relief. She softly pushed open the door and walked in quietly, trying not to make too much noise, as Aunt Linda seemed to be asleep. Just as she set the food down, a slightly hoarse voice said, "Eve, you're here." Eve smiled and turned around, gently holding Aunt Linda's frail hand, which felt like a dried-up branch with no flesh. "Aunt Linda, my mom made carp soup for you. I've told you not to trouble yourselves like this anymore. The hospital cafeteria food is quite good," Aunt Linda said as Eve helped her sit up. Eve quickly adjusted the pillows behind her to make her more comfortable. After Aunt Linda was comfortably seated, Eve brought out the soup, carefully blew on it to cool it down, and then fed it to her. Seeing how attentively Eve took care of her, Aunt Linda weakly sighed, "Eve, if only you were my daughter-in-law, I wouldn't have to worry about that boy anymore. He decided to tell me only after making up his mind that he's getting married. I haven't even met the girl, and I don't know anything about her personality. Do you know who he's marrying? Tell me about her." Eve couldn't bring herself to praise Natalie Young insincerely. It was something she didn't want to do. But looking at the frail Aunt Linda, she had no choice but to say a few kind words about Natalie Young. "Natalie Young was my roommate before. She's very beautiful and kind, and she handles everything well. I really don't know how to describe her." Just thinking about Natalie Young's smug smile made Eve unable to continue. She reluctantly added a few more words to make it sound plausible. Aunt Linda asked doubtfully, "Is that all?" Eve smiled awkwardly and brought the spoon to Aunt Linda's mouth. After a moment of thought, she said, "Well, after we graduated, I didn't see much of Luke Quinn. It was only recently, when he announced his marriage, that we met again. So, I don't know much either. He will probably bring her to meet you in the next few days." Aunt Linda swallowed the soup, but after a few sips, she said she didn't want any more. Eve tried to persuade her, but she shook her head, saying she couldn't drink any more. After gently wiping Aunt Linda's mouth, Eve asked attentively, "Aunt Linda, would you like some fruit? I can peel it for you. Don't trouble yourself, just sit here and chat with me for a while." "Aunt Linda, you've been in this hospital for too long, it feels like there's no vitality here." Aunt Linda gently pulled Eve's soft, smooth hand and lightly stroked it. "When Luke Quinn's father was still alive, he arranged a childhood marriage for you two. Later, seeing how close you two were growing up, I thought. In the end, it's that boy who's not lucky enough." "It's not that he's not lucky, it's that he's not qualified," Eve sighed heavily in her heart. Not only did Aunt Linda think that she and Luke Quinn would end up together, but even she herself had believed that. That was also why she never confessed her feelings to him. She thought that their relationship had been sealed since middle school, maybe even elementary school. They would marry, have children, and grow old together. But in the end, she was too confident. She was so confident that she believed that in Luke Quinn's eyes and heart, there would never be another girl besides her. "Aunt Linda, don't say that. Luke is very outstanding. Maybe we're too familiar with each other, so there's no spark, or he's always seen me as a sister." "Yes, you're right. Besides that explanation, I can't think of any other." Seeing a hint of disappointment on Eve's face, Aunt Linda quickly changed the subject. Eve, I'd like to go to the bathroom." Eve hurriedly collected her scattered emotions, smiled, and nodded. She carefully helped Aunt Linda out of bed. They left the ward and slowly made their way towards the public restroom at the end of the hallway. Aunt Linda and Eve's mother were both women who had suffered hardships. So, even if Luke Quinn wasn't involved, Eve would still treat Aunt Linda with sincerity and care. While Aunt Linda was in the bathroom, Eve waited outside in the hallway. From a distance, she saw Luke Quinn walking toward her. He was still in his suit, likely having just come straight from work. Episode 4. For some reason, Eve's heartbeat became uncontrollably faster and faster. Suddenly, she wanted to find somewhere to hide, anywhere, as long as Luke Quinn couldn't see her. But as soon as she saw him, he also saw her, and it was too late to hide. She forced a smile that she hoped wasn't too bad and glanced at her reflection in a nearby mirror. The woman in the mirror was smiling, but it looked awkward and unnatural. After adjusting her smile to look more appropriate, she turned to face Luke Quinn as he approached. Luke Quinn stopped 2 steps away from her, giving her a slight nod. Before he mentioned getting married, their interactions weren't like this. Why did everything change? After he talked about the wedding? Neither of them spoke first. In the past, it was always Eve who initiated the conversation, and Luke Quinn would follow. That was how things always went. But today, Eve didn't want to do that anymore. She waited for him to say something first, anything. After a moment of silence, neither of them said a word. Eve laughed bitterly inside, finding the situation ironic. This time, she had lost the gamble completely. She lowered her head. Eve swallowed back the emotion in her eyes, while Luke Quinn stood in front of her. Due to their height difference, he could only see the shiny black crown of her head. His lips twitched, but in the end, he didn't say a word. From inside the restroom, Aunt Linda's voice broke the silence between the two. Luke Quinn stepped forward, intending to go in, but then realized it was the women's restroom, and he couldn't go inside. He took a step back. Eve, with her head down, mischievously thought, "Go in, go in. Why are you stopping? If you don't say anything today, I won't go in." Aunt Linda called out a few more times from inside, but Eve didn't respond, as she was waiting for Luke Quinn to speak first. Luke Quinn glanced at Eve, his eyes as deep and dark as a black hole, seemingly capable of pulling anyone in with just a glance. Luke Quinn stepped forward and stopped a passing nurse. "Nurse, my mother is in the restroom. Could you help her, please?" This simple, gentle action made Eve feel hopeless. Was he really not willing to say a single word to her? Or did he just not want to trouble her anymore? She realized she had been acting a little stubborn earlier. She wouldn't do it again. Before the nurse could arrive, Eve turned and went into the restroom to help Aunt Linda out. As she emerged, she smiled softly at the nurse and said, "It's okay, we can handle it ourselves." The nurse gave Eve a sideways glance and walked away without a word, having misunderstood Eve. The nurse misunderstood Eve as a bad daughter-in-law who didn't want to take care of her mother-in-law. Luke Quinn stepped forward, taking his mother from Eve's hands, and coldly said, "Thank you." These two polite yet distant words were like a cruel line drawn between them, one that could never be crossed. Eve felt a sharp pain in her heart, making it hard to breathe. The atmosphere around them dropped to freezing levels, making Eve shiver. Her hands stiffened as she let go of Aunt Linda, unsure of where to place them, as they suddenly felt out of place. When Aunt Linda saw her son return, she was so happy that she completely forgot Eve was still there. She focused entirely on chatting with her son, not noticing the subtle changes in the room. Eve quietly followed them into the room, intending to silently grab her things and leave this suffocating place as quickly as possible. Luke Quinn helped his mother back onto the bed and stood by her side, attentively asking, "Mom, are you feeling better today? Natalie Young said she'll come take care of you tomorrow, so you won't need to trouble anyone else." Anyone else? Who could that be other than Eve? They had known each other for over a decade, yet Eve never realized he could be so heartless in his words. Bracing herself, Eve quickly gathered up the lunch containers, just wanting to finish up and leave as fast as possible. Seeing her son's sharp and gaunt Linda features, Aunt Linda thought about the soup that was left earlier. Her heart ached. Her son was so focused on work that he had completely neglected his own health. Aunt Linda held Luke Quinn's hand gently and said, "Eve brought carp soup over. I didn't have much of an appetite, so I only drank a little, but there's still a lot left. You should have some too, to nourish yourself. Ever since I was hospitalized, no one has been cooking for you, and you've been staying here every night to take care of me. You've gotten so thin, it makes me feel so bad." Eve's movements froze as she was packing the lunchbox. The soup she had just sealed up now had to be taken out again, forcing her to redo the process. She didn't say anything, only fearing that he would say, "No need," making her efforts go to waste. And just as she expected, Luke Quinn glanced at Eve's stiff back and said, "No need, I've made dinner plans with Natalie Young. Finish up and I'll drive you home." Natalie Young, Natalie Young. It was always Natalie Young. Would he die if he didn't mention her in every sentence? Over and over, Luke Quinn kept emphasizing Natalie Young's presence, did he think she was the type of woman who couldn't let go or would cling to him? Thinking this, Eve felt her anger rising, but she kept her composure, slowly sealing the lid of the lunchbox. Aunt Linda sensed the tension between the two, but she couldn't intervene in matters between her children. After all, fate is unpredictable. She turned to Luke Quinn and said, "You should take Eve home. I'm feeling a bit tired now." She pulled up the blanket and closed her eyes. After finishing packing, Eve turned to leave, but Luke Quinn's tall and imposing figure blocked her way. His lips twisted into a stiff smile. I'll head home now," she said. Luke Quinn gave a simple nod in response. Luke Quinn stood blocking the way, showing no intention of stepping aside. Eve remained silent, as if stubbornly standing her ground, eyes downcast. After a few seconds, a deep, cold voice finally sounded from above her, "Let's go, I'll take you home." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked towards the door. Eve stared intently at his distant, indifferent back, feeling as though her heart had drowned in a cold, desolate abyss. Standing on the steps outside the hospital, Eve paused and turned to face him, who was standing a meter behind. She smiled and said, "You still have dinner plans with Natalie Young, don't you?" "I'll walk home by myself." Although part of her wished he would take her a little farther, what was the point? He was getting married in a few days. Spending a few more minutes with him wouldn't change anything. Luke Quinn looked at her, his deep eyes meeting her bright, sparkling gaze in the fading sunlight. Though she wasn't conventionally beautiful with her short hair and simple appearance, she had a charm that made her stand out. He had been looking at her for over 10 years, yet instead of growing tired of her, he found her more and more captivating, with a unique beauty different from other women. His gaze revealed curiosity, as if he was trying to discern the truth behind her words, making Eve hesitant to meet his intense, profound eyes directly. Luke Quinn was the kind of man who was flawless from every angle, radiating perfection. When he spoke and smiled, he exuded warmth and sunshine. When he was silent and composed, he carried an aura of quiet strength and magnetism. But now, he couldn't figure out what he had done wrong. Or perhaps he had said something wrong. The look in Luke Quinn's eyes was full of disdain, disgust, and even intense hatred. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, skillfully lit it, and took a deep drag. Wisps of smoke drifted from his mouth and nose. "Eve, you don't need to worry about my mom anymore. Tell Aunt Linda Jo that she doesn't need to trouble herself. From now on, Natalie Young will take care of my mom. I don't want you two running into each other." Eve quietly tightened her grip on the lunchbox in her hand, her nails digging into her palm as she clenched her fist, but her smile remained unchanged. "Okay, I'll let my mom know. Goodbye." Before she could finish speaking, Luke Quinn impatiently averted his gaze. Eve tried to console herself, "It's nothing, just an unrequited crush that never went anywhere. Life is still long, one failed love can't break me." But her tears flowed like a flood, uncontrollable and overwhelming, mourning the unspoken love that was extinguished before it even had a chance to grow. As Eve turned away, Luke Quinn's gaze followed her, his eyes no longer cold and distant but filled with hidden reluctance and helplessness beneath the surface. The next day, after finishing her shift at the fitness club, Eve ran into a few members who hadn't gone home yet. They gathered together, and one of them suggested going for drinks. Eve initially wanted to refuse, saying she had something to do at home, but it was hard to say no when the person suggesting it was a handsome guy with looks comparable to Wallace Chung. Thinking about it, during this post-breakup phase, going out wouldn't hurt. A group of them picked a recently renovated, artsy cafe nearby. They poured in and chose a seat by the window. Once seated, the group quickly started chattering away, each adding their own comments. Eve occasionally chimed in with a word or two. Clearly, she wasn't the type to act like Lin Dayu, but in the past few days, whenever she had some free time, she found herself pretending to be sad. Sitting next to her was an older woman, but thanks to her good self-care, few people could tell her real age. Some even thought she was a young woman in her early 20s. The woman nudged Eve gently and whispered, "Coach Lee, are you heartbroken? You've seemed out of it all day. I noticed something was off with you this morning. Now that everyone's talking, why don't you share?" Eve bit on her straw, looking like a little bunny, as all the eyes around her turned her way. After taking a sip of her juice, she said seriously, "Sister, I haven't even been in a relationship yet, so how could I be heartbroken? You all won't get any juicy gossip from me. There's nothing, my love life is as blank as a sheet of paper." The guy sitting across from her, who looked like a mini Wallace Chung, let out a low chuckle. Realizing he laughed too openly, he quickly shut his mouth and took a sip of juice. Eve glanced at him, raised her eyebrows, and said generously, "If you want to laugh, just laugh. Holding it in will only give you internal injuries, and you won't be able to recover when you get home. There's no one here who'll help you, right?" Everyone, except for Wallace Chung, was keeping quiet in unity. Yeah, they say older women can be stubborn. Eve didn't believe it before, but now she does. One question after another was thrown her way. It was as if they were conducting a background check. "Coach Eve, you're so beautiful, you must have lots of admirers, right? When do you plan to get a boyfriend or get married? Do you have any requirements for your partner?" Eve could sense a strong purpose behind these questions, as if there was an underlying motive. So, this was why today's gathering felt strange to her. If she really had so many people chasing after her, would she be sitting here with such a bitter face? She reached up to adjust her bangs and said sorrowfully, "Ah, sister, I also think I look decent, but no one likes me, no one's pursuing me. You can't force these things. When it's meant to happen, it'll happen. If it's not meant to be, there's no use thinking about it." After that, she took a sip of her juice, as if she were holding a beer. The woman next to her continued pushing forward, not giving up on her goal. "I think it's because your standards as a coach are too high. In our club, there are plenty of great guys. Look at the one sitting across from you, all of them are good enough to take out on a date, right?" Episode 5. Following the woman's finger, Eve glanced over and saw Wallace Chung, who was blushing while sipping on his juice. She smiled brightly. Startled, Wallace Chung took several sips of juice, but the cup had long been empty. Eve saw this and, despite knowing that he wasn't that young, at that moment, he seemed even younger than her. As an unrelated older sister, she kindly said, "Hey, you're out of juice. If you want more, I'll order you another cup." Everyone glanced at Wallace Chung, who was blushing furiously. In Eve's mind, she pictured a funny scene, the blushing guy suddenly acting like a drama queen, saying, "You guys are so annoying. I'm not playing with you anymore." Big pillar, don't think like that. You'll ruin the image of the idol Appa in your heart. After chatting for a while, Eve got up to go to the restroom. On the highway, Ethan Parker was driving, one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding a phone. After putting it on speaker, he tossed the phone onto the dashboard. On the other end, Skylar Parker was rambling on and on. "Ethan, you can't stand them up again this time. If you meet them and don't properly apologize to your boss, I'll break your legs when you get back. You know your mother's been on my case. If you're a filial son, you'd better find a woman to marry and have a child. Once you do that, I won't care what you do afterward. Are you even listening to me?" Ethan Parker sighed and hung up. He'd heard these words so many times he could recite them backward, so there was no need to listen. The old man wouldn't be satisfied until he saw him married with children, and he kept setting him up on blind dates. The car pulled into the parking lot, and he casually walked into the cafe. This time, the blind date. She was the woman Ethan Parker stood up last time. It seemed like she was determined to marry into the Pei family. Following the location given by the old man, Ethan Parker walked over. The woman inside had a somewhat irritated expression, but when she saw Ethan Parker, she put on a ladylike smile. Ethan Parker politely shook her hand, and after exchanging basic information, he sat down with a serious expression, as if he were handling a formal transaction. For him, this was just a mandatory formality. The woman had thought that a man as handsome as Ethan Parker would be witty and humorous, but once they sat down, an awkward silence filled the air. How was a woman from high society supposed to start a conversation in this situation? Seeing that Ethan Parker hadn't ordered anything to drink, she felt a little pleased. This was a chance to break the ice. She softly asked, "Mr. Parker, what do you like to drink?" Ethan Parker, sitting upright, always gave off an impression of being meticulous and somewhat distant. With her presence, the atmosphere remained in a state of cold tension. He casually replied, "Just water." There was no need for him to let this woman know his preferences, so he just picked something random. The woman, noticing Ethan Parker's indifferent and dismissive attitude, felt uncomfortable. Her family had a strong background and was one of the top families in Zhangcharlsk. If it weren't for her parents repeatedly pushing her to win over Ethan Parker, she wouldn't have wanted to sit here and endure this. She didn't want to stay even one more minute. "Mr. Pei, your tastes are quite different from the norm." This was something Ethan Parker hadn't considered before. It seemed this woman had privately investigated him. But it didn't matter, if she knew when to back off, he wouldn't make things difficult for her. The woman called the waiter and ordered a glass of water for Ethan Parker. After the water was served, she pondered how to continue the conversation. Ethan Parker picked up the glass of water from the table, his tone cold and distant. "Miss Yu, I believe you're aware of the purpose of today's meeting. My father has arranged for us to meet twice, which suggests he holds you in high regard. However, I currently have no plans to get married." As long as it wasn't an outright rejection, there was still hope. Miss Yu's emotions felt like a winding mountain road, twisting and turning, but finally finding a way out. "In that regard, I agree with you, Mr. Parker. I don't have any immediate plans for marriage either. But we can continue to get to know each other with marriage in mind, and if we feel like it later, we can talk about it. It's not impossible." The two continued talking, but the conversation kept circling back to the word marriage. Ethan Parker didn't want to continue with this topic and fell silent, listening to Miss Yu speak. His gaze wandered around the cafe, and just as he glanced elsewhere, a familiar figure appeared in his line of sight. This was a figure he wouldn't forget anytime soon. Eve walked out of the restroom, casually grabbing a paper towel from the dispenser on the wall. She felt like her hands weren't fully dry and needed a little more wiping. As she wiped her hands, she walked back towards her group of friends, her eyes focused on them, unaware of the people around her. Ethan Parker watched Eve walking over, a sly smile tugging at the corner of his lips. When Miss Yu looked up and saw this charming smile, she thought it was directed at her, causing her heart to race and her face to flush deeply. It seemed like she was starting to like this man. But in the next second, she heard Ethan Parker jokingly say, "Wait a moment, let me introduce you to someone." Just as he finished speaking, Eve happened to be walking past their table. Ethan Parker reached out with his large hand, grabbing and pulling Eve into his arms. Eve let out a startled yelp and fell into Ethan Parker's lap in an awkward and embarrassing position. Her heart nearly leaped out of her chest from the shock. The first thing Eve did after regaining her senses was blindly apologize, regardless of whether it was her fault or not. She swallowed hard, and before even looking up to see Ethan Parker's face, she repeatedly said, "Sorry, sorry, sorry." After a while, when she still hadn't been let go, Eve turned her head, staring for 3 seconds, frozen for 2 more, and then she exclaimed, "It's you." Right after that, Eve quickly remembered the few bills in her bag. Looking at the handsome, charming smile on the man's face, she stammered at first, then firmly said, "I already gave you the money. I really don't have any more. Are you following me? How did you find me here? Your paparazzi skills are impressive. So, who are you performing for this time?" Eve, still unaware of the situation, glanced at the woman across from her, whose face had turned dark with displeasure. She thought to herself, is this woman going to find a secluded spot later to deal with me? Eve adjusted her leaning posture, sitting properly beside Ethan Parker. It wasn't that she didn't want to leave, but Ethan Parker had her arm pinned behind her back. Every time she tried to move, he pulled her even closer. Feeling uneasy, Eve nervously explained, "Miss, please don't misunderstand. I'm not associated with him at all, we're complete strangers. I don't even know who he is. You two are on a blind date, so I won't disturb you. Sir, I'm sure your teacher taught you how to be polite to others, right?" Ethan Parker let out a faint smile, different from his earlier sly grin, this one bright and cheerful. Eve had a weakness for guys with beautiful smiles. Whenever she saw one, her legs would go weak, and her brain would stop functioning, leaving her frozen in place. It seemed like she was destined to fall for a smile like that. Ethan Parker pulled Eve even closer, holding her hand, then draped his arm around her shoulders. His other hand gently pressed her head against his shoulder. Once everything was in place, his deep eyes were filled with such tenderness that it could drown anyone. "Oh, I forgot to mention to Miss you, I already have a girlfriend. She's a bit mischievous and likes to play around with me like this in front of others. Please don't mind her." "Girlfriend?" Eve looked up at him in shock. Eve glanced again at the woman across from her, whose face had turned ashen as if she'd just been slapped by fate. She was about to speak, but at some point, a large hand had started patting her head, with a firm yet gentle touch. Through the mirror-like interior design of the cafe, Eve saw it looked like Ethan Parker was petting his beloved pet. She glanced at the two people in front of her, and honestly, she really did look like a little dog. Every time she tried to speak, Ethan Parker would pat her head harder, forcing her to swallow all her words. She looked up at him with a mix of innocence and frustration, but his face remained unchanged as he continued to pat her head. As he did so, he said softly, "Don't cause trouble, or she'll laugh at you." His gentle tone made Eve's stomach churn, her legs shaking with annoyance, almost making her feel like throwing up. The overly affectionate tone even made the person across from them break out in goosebumps. Eve couldn't help but think this man might be some kind of oddball. Miss Yu, sitting across from them, had had enough. Coming here today had already been humiliating enough for her, but now she felt as if her dignity was being trampled underfoot. If he didn't like her, he could have just said so. There was no need to flaunt Linda his affection for someone else in front of her like this. Having been spoiled and pampered her entire life, Miss Yu couldn't stomach this anger. She suddenly stood up, grabbed the glass of water on the table, and without saying a word, threw it directly at Eve. Not wanting to get splashed himself, Ethan Parker pulled Eve in front of him as a shield. As a result, poor Eve got drenched. For a moment, Eve's mind went blank after getting soaked. But after just a second, she wanted to shout out a curse. "Damn it, she threw water all over me. I didn't even do anything. Do I really deserve this?" The woman grabbed her bag, gave Eve a spiteful glare, and stormed off in a fury, her high heels clicking loudly as she left. At the same time the woman left, Ethan Parker released Eve's hand with a look of disdain. Seeing Eve soaked like a drenched poodle, he let out another soft chuckle. Eve wiped the water off her face, glaring bitterly at the man in front of her. The hatred inside her was palpable. This man was truly despicable. At the critical moment, he pulled her in to shield himself from the water. And now, watching him smile smugly, Eve felt utterly annoyed, completely frustrated. In a moment of madness, Eve did something she would never want to remember for the rest of her life. Sitting there like a soaked poodle, she shook herself wildly, flinging water everywhere, drenching Ethan Parker in the process. Seeing Ethan Parker's face darken, Eve suddenly felt a wave of fear. This man, when serious, was terrifying. She figured it was best to slip away before he had a chance to get angry. After all, last time was partly her fault for not fully understanding the situation. Just as she was about to get up, Ethan Parker's large hand reached out, stopping her. She turned around, ready to shout, "What do you want?" But then she saw him stuffing money into her hand, and she froze, dumbfounded, watching him put the money in her hand. As he left, Ethan Parker didn't forget to offer some comforting words. "You'd better go see a doctor and make sure you don't catch a cold, it'll save you from spending more money. You did a good job today, you've earned this." The amount was predictably 438 yuan. The 38 yuan in change was due to some small quirk of circumstance. Regarding her two mischievous nephews, Eve took them to kindergarten this morning. At the entrance, they insisted on buying 2 gotcha toys before going in. The 38 yuan left was from the change after buying the toys for them. Eve squeezed the money in her hand, feeling the strange sensation of having someone randomly shove money into her hand. But, it wasn't a bad feeling. Watching the man walk away, she counted the money again, muttering, 438, 438, dead 38, as her anger flared up. She clenched the money tightly and chased after Ethan Parker. The sunlight in Wanshi was bright, dyeing the sky a deep red, resembling a glowing orange in the distance. Eve looked around, then turned back to see a white Jaguar pulling out. As the car passed her, the driver playfully honked. Recognizing the man inside, Eve felt so furious that she wanted to take off her shoe and throw it at him. However, as she bent down to do so, she noticed a group of curious onlookers peering through the cafe window. Eve straightened up gracefully, shook her wet hair, and flashed a confident smile at the group, like a queen among mere mortals. Eve swore she would not let this grudge go. Episode 6. For the next few days, she went to work, came home, helped her mom with the stall, and occasionally checked on the hair salon. The rest of the time, she stayed at home, biding her time for revenge. Today was Saturday, and Eve had the day off. Early in the morning, her mother came knocking on her door. Even though she had stuffed her ears with headphones and earplugs for years, she still couldn't block out her mother's vigorous knocking. Lowering her voice, Eve asked, "Mom, it's my day off today. What are you planning? Is your hand itching to do something this early in the morning?" As they spoke, Eve had already gotten up to open the door. She glanced at her mother, who was already fully dressed, and then turned to walk back toward the bed. But before she could take a step, her mother grabbed her by the collar and dragged her back. James Joe looked at her carefree daughter with a sigh, thinking, how is it that she doesn't have any sense of being a proper girl at all? It's so worrying. She's already at the age to get married, yet she still acts so indifferent. How will she ever get married like this? However, seeing Eve yawning adorably, she couldn't bring herself to say anything harsh. Feeling sorry for her, she gently said, "Eve, hurry up and wash up. I'll take you to buy a proper dress. Today is Luke's wedding, and we're going to attend." Luke, wedding. Slowly, Eve's thoughts returned to the present. A few days ago, Natalie Young had been texting her constantly, but she didn't respond, and in the end, she blocked her. Now that she thought about it, it was probably to tell her the wedding date and invite her to the wedding. A wave of sadness surged in her heart, making her eyes heat up. Eve turned over and pulled the blanket over her head, weakly saying, "Mom, you decide. I'm really tired. Let me sleep just a little longer, okay?" "No way. You, girl, how can you be so inconsiderate? Get up and wash your face." Tears silently fell from Eve's eyes, and fearing her mother might lift the blanket and see, she quickly wiped them away with the blanket and playfully asked, "Going out for what? Not setting up the stall today?" "That's a miracle, Mom." In the past, no matter if it was windy or rainy, James Joe would open her shop to do business. But today, with the northeast wind blowing, she wasn't opening. James Joe angrily tapped her daughter on the head, cold-hearted. "So you didn't hear a word of what I just said? I'll give you 5 minutes to get up quickly." In the evening, Eve wore a black and white dress borrowed from Emily Palmer. Originally, she had planned to go with her mother, but in the afternoon, her mother received a call from Ethan Parker. Since she had only been out of the hospital for a few days and was struggling to handle Chin Luke's wedding preparations, she asked Eve's mother to arrive early to help. Before leaving, her mother repeatedly reminded her to arrive on time, or it would be too inappropriate. Emily Palmer also advised Eve that she should attend. Otherwise, that dog couple might really think they're important. Not only should she go, but she should dress up beautifully and make sure to enjoy the meal to make up for the money she spent. Standing in front of the grand and majestic Yukai Hotel, Eve hesitated about whether to go in. If she went in and saw that family, would her heart break? Probably. But running away wasn't her style. Clenching her fist, she pounded her chest and walked in with the spirit of facing anything. As she entered the hotel, a server escorted Eve into the banquet hall. The luxurious, dazzling hall was lit by sparkling chandeliers, with small groups of people scattered around, chatting and laughing. Everywhere, people were walking back and forth, some holding wine glasses, leisurely strolling between tables, some wandering around looking for a target, while others were engaging in conversations. Some guests drank red wine alone, but Eve was only focused on finding food. Eating was an effective way for her to relieve stress. She grabbed some wine from a server's tray, pairing it with a variety of small pastries on the table, and happily indulged. After eating for quite a while, the wedding banquet officially began. All the guests were led to the dining room. Eve chose a corner table and sat down. Soon enough, the surrounding seats were filled with guests she didn't recognize. After drinking quite a bit of red wine, she felt the urge to go to the bathroom. Worried that someone might take her seat while she was away, Eve borrowed a pen from a server and wrote "occupied" 3 times on a napkin before leaving. After finishing her business, she stood at the sink, splashing water on her face. Looking at her small, oval face in the mirror, Eve smiled to herself. This face is actually pretty good. Completely immersed in her self-admiration, she hadn't noticed someone had been standing beside her. That person coldly said, with disdain, "No matter how much you look, a flower isn't going to bloom." Eve turned her head, thinking, why do you care who I admire? But when she saw the high nose bridge and familiar profile, her eyebrow twitched. It really is a case of enemies meeting again. Furiously shaking the water off her hands, Eve grabbed some tissues to dry them, tossing them into the trash as if Ethan Parker in front of her was completely invisible. As she passed by him to leave, she silently cursed, "Idiot." Still drying his hands, Ethan Parker seemed to sense that someone had just cursed him. Eve turned sideways and saw that she had already walked out. Truly, it seemed like fate, recently. Wherever he went, he ran into Miss 438. Returning to the dining hall, he looked at his seat, only to find a middle-aged man sitting there. If it had been a younger person, he would have gone over and pulled them up. What kind of illiterate person couldn't see the 3 words he had left? Looking through the window at the crowded dining hall, Eve realized that finding a new seat now would be difficult. Any empty seats might have already been claimed. Thinking about it, she decided it might be a good excuse to leave early. If her mom asked, she'd have a reason to shake her head. But just as she turned, she bumped into Ethan Parker, who had just walked in from outside. The collision caused Eve to lose her balance, her high heels slipping as she fell backward. Fortunately, Ethan Parker wasn't one to hold grudges and quickly reached out to catch her, pulling her into his arms. Once she had calmed down, Eve glanced at Ethan Parker, reluctantly muttering, "Thanks, sorry for the trouble." Ethan Parker looked down at her, his eyes sparkling like stars, almost making him appear like a glowing angel. The man, described as an angel, however, had a mischievous smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I thought you were going to say thank you." Eve pursed her lips, indifferent, and turned to leave. Ethan Parker watched her and asked seriously, "You're attending the wedding too?" What he really wanted to say was, "I keep running into you everywhere." If it weren't for this girl's clear, spring-like eyes, Ethan Parker would have thought that all the situations they encountered were deliberately created by her to get his attention. Eve didn't want to pay attention to him and continued walking. But after just a few steps, Ethan Parker approached. Seeing Eve with a mature, handsome man, she naturally assumed he was Eve's boyfriend and hurriedly invited them to sit down, informing them that the wedding was about to start. Feeling awkward from the misunderstanding, Eve quickly said, I need to go to the restroom. But Ethan Parker, seemingly sent by the heavens to ruin everything, coldly remarked, didn't you just go? Luckily, Ethan Parker was too busy, and after saying a few more words, she left to greet other guests. Eve glared at Ethan Parker, as if she wanted to see through him. Under her gaze, Ethan Parker reached out, gently pulled her closer, and led the flustered, blushing Eve to the front table. As soon as Eve sat down, she felt burning gazes coming at her from all directions, making her extremely uncomfortable. She was about to get up and leave and Ethan Parker placed his hand on hers and calmly said, "The wedding is about to start. Don't walk around." At that moment, all the lights in the hall suddenly dimmed, leaving only the small, bright bulbs lighting the aisle leading to the stage. The aisle had been decorated earlier by the wedding planners, and when she saw it, it had felt warm, sweet, and dreamy. Soft, enchanting music slowly began to play throughout the hall. On the large screen above the stage, a video began to play, showing the journey of how Luke and Natalie Young met, got to know each other, and fell in love. The romantic and beautiful scenes filled Eve with contempt for the couple, thinking to herself, it's all just pretense. However, her gaze still couldn't help but drift toward the screen, her heart filled with jealousy and longing. She grabbed her wine glass and drank it all in one go, trying to suppress the anger building inside her. Ethan Parker, sitting next to her, wasn't fond of women who drank, and seeing Eve drink one glass after another, he subtly shifted away from her, his eyes showing faint disgust. After a few glasses of wine, Eve's head started spinning, her vision blurring, and everything seemed doubled. Suddenly, she stood up, her eyes fixed on the couple kissing on the stage. Her eyes filled with tears, which under the glow of the crystal chandelier above, sparkled like transparent diamonds. All the attention in the hall shifted to Eve, with some people curious, others disapproving. Those who were sharp could easily guess the backstory, and many were waiting for a good show to unfold. At that moment, a strong spotlight suddenly focused on Eve, leaving her so flustered that she forgot to sit back down. They say every girl has a guardian angel, but why am I in such a mess and my angel still hasn't appeared? Eve thought to herself. As the music played, a tear, glistening like a diamond, slipped down her cheek, disappearing into the brightness of the spotlight. In front of her, a hand appeared, palms slowly opening toward her. Eve lowered her gaze and saw that it was Ethan Parker's hand. She looked at him, he was still in the light while she remained in the dark. However, the darkness did nothing to hide his dazzling glow. He was like an angel who had fallen to earth, passing by and rescuing someone as ordinary as her. Ethan Parker pursed his lips, and in Eve's eyes, it formed a curve she thought was a smile. Her panicked heart gradually calmed down, its rhythm steadying. She was no longer afraid of the sharp, judgmental gazes. Eve smiled, feeling the courage of being reborn. She slowly placed her hand in his palm. After sitting down, Eve recalled the earlier embarrassment, and she felt too shy to look at him. She stole a few glances, and then Ethan Parker's cool, powerful voice broke the silence, "If you want to look, just look openly." Flustered, Eve immediately retorted, "Who's looking at you? What's so great about a pair of eyes and a mouth?" She reached for the glass of wine on the table and slowly drank it. Ethan Parker furrowed his brows, his hands folded on his lap, and leaned back slightly. His tailored suit only accentuated his refined, carefree demeanor. Taking advantage of today, Eve decided to drink to her heart's content. Maybe after a good drunken night, she would wake up with a heart that didn't ache anymore. She poured glass after glass down her throat. As the saying goes, it's not the wine that gets people drunk, they get drunk on their own. Normally, Eve had a strong tolerance for alcohol, and light drinks couldn't knock her down. But today, With just a few light drinks, Eve was already drunk. Normally, when she was drunk, she would fall asleep the moment she hit the bed, no drunken tantrums, no vomiting. All she needed was a place to lie down, and she could quietly sleep. As the banquet reached its halfway point, her vision started to blur, and everything in front of her seemed to overlap. She looked at Ethan Parker, but in her eyes, she saw multiple versions of him. Her face flushed red, Eve raised her hand, her fingers swaying unsteadily, and in a slurred voice, she said, you have so many heads, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good, good. Are you a magician? Can you make everyone here disappear? But don't make him disappear, okay? As she spoke, her head swayed along, and her mouth alternated between a smile and a pout, as if someone had bullied her. Ethan Parker could only think that if he had known she would get this drunk, he wouldn't have brought her to this seat. Now, he had to take care of this drunken mess. Although he was annoyed by her drinking, Ethan Parker patiently lifted her from the chair, letting her lean against his chest. After saying goodbye to the hosts, he guided her out of the banquet hall. To his surprise, despite never having vomited when drunk before, Eve suddenly leaned over and vomited after just a few steps. Her stomach couldn't handle the undigested food. She grabbed onto the expensive lapel of Ethan Parker's suit and threw up, all while mumbling incoherent words that Ethan Parker couldn't understand. Ethan Parker helplessly let go of his hands, closing his eyes in frustration, waiting for Eve to finish vomiting. God knows how much he wanted to hold her accountable right now. Eve wiped her mouth with her hand, and then, without hesitation, wrapped her arms around Ethan Parker's waist, making him feel disgusted. He quickly pushed her away as if she were carrying a plague. Holding Eve with one arm, it was clear he couldn't just leave this filthy, stinky mess of a girl on the street. He rushed to the front desk, his face dark, swiped his card, and booked a room. The staff led them into a standard suite. As soon as they entered the room, Ethan Parker's patience had reached its limit. He threw Eve onto the carpet, and being the decent person he was, at least he didn't toss her onto the balcony to sober up in the night wind. Ignoring Eve lying on the floor, he quickly undid his collar and threw off his jacket, tossing it carelessly. The jacket landed right at Eve's feet. Glancing at her sprawled out on the floor, an unexplainable irritation rose within him. He headed to the bathroom. After vomiting, Eve was a bit more sober. She lifted her head, scanning the room, feeling unfamiliar. It didn't look like home. She groped around the floor and found the jacket at her feet. Groggily, she grabbed the jacket. Whether it was the food she ate tonight or the cologne on the jacket making her feel sick, she once again clutched Ethan Parker's jacket and threw up. When Ethan Parker came out wrapped in a towel, the scene Ethan Parker saw was Eve clutching his coat, vomiting furiously onto it. His coat was covered in filth, and in frustration, he kicked the chair beside him hard. Is this woman pretending to be drunk to cause trouble, he thought. Watching as Eve's head swayed, about to press down on the mess, he found himself doing something inexplicable. Just as her head was about to touch it, he stepped forward and caught her head. Unfortunately, his hand landed right on the mess. Muttering a harsh shit, he ripped the coat from Eve's hands and threw it aside. Grabbing the woman on the floor, he pulled her up, and with a swift move, threw her onto the bed. She didn't deserve gentle treatment. As soon as Eve hit the soft bed, she stretched out her limbs like a fish in the deep sea, searching for a comfortable position before drifting into a deep sleep. In her sleep, she muttered Chin Luke's name, her voice soft but unnervingly clear in the silence of the suite. Standing by the bed, Ethan Parker frowned. So, she was drowning her sorrows in alcohol over a lost love. How pathetic and pitiful. He initially planned to leave, but a strange, indescribable feeling arose in his heart. He grabbed a pillow and decided to sleep on the sofa for the night. Lying down, he glanced at the lone crescent moon hanging high in the sky outside the window. Ethan Parker couldn't fall asleep. After tossing and turning a few times, he still couldn't sleep. Partly because the air had an unpleasant smell, and partly because Eve occasionally called out in her sleep, disturbing him. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore and got off the sofa. Eve called the attendant, intending to switch to another room, but was informed that all the rooms were fully booked. Reluctantly, he asked the staff to tidy up the suite and change Eve's dirty clothes, along with his own, and send them for cleaning. The next morning, Eve woke up with a splitting headache. Groggily, she raised herself, wiping her face and struggling to open her blurry eyes. The first thing she saw was the luxurious crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Where was she? How did she end up here? What happened last night? Why was she drunk? With a flood of questions swirling in her mind, Eve pushed herself up, her body feeling like it was falling apart. Instinctively, she glanced around the room. When her eyes landed on a pair of men's shoes at the foot of the bed, a thought flashed across her mind. She shivered and quickly looked away. Glancing at her body, she realized she was only in her bra and underwear. Oh my God! Who did this? Eve immediately felt like crying, but no tears came. What divine punishment had she received this year? First, she'd been heartbroken, and now someone had taken advantage of her. She quickly dressed in the neatly folded dress placed on the bedside table. Eve slapped her cheeks, trying to calm herself down. Hearing the sound of running water from the bathroom, her body trembled as she got off the bed, feeling panic inside, but her actions remained surprisingly calm and decisive. She tiptoed quietly. Eve quietly walked over to the sofa, picked up the wallet on the coffee table, and took a look at the ID inside. The man in the photo looked young, but Eve instantly recognized him, Ethan Parker, a despicable scoundrel, truly a human disgrace. The sound of running water echoed from the bathroom, and her gaze fixed on the bathroom door, noticing the vague silhouette behind it. Eve mischievously thought to herself, I'm not someone you can easily mess with. She walked straight to the landline phone and, without hesitation, dialed the police. Hello, police. I want to report an assault. After hanging up, images of the perpetrator being brought to justice flashed through her mind. The anger that had been building in her chest slowly dissipated. Eve slipped on the hotel's disposable slippers and sat back like a queen, waiting for the police to arrive. To prevent the man inside from escaping, she threw his shoes away, along with the pants on the coffee table. The wallet and watch were kept as evidence, ready to be handed over to the police. When Ethan Parker came out wrapped in a towel, he saw someone with a messy, bird's nest, of hair sitting on the sofa. Droplets of water were still clinging to his hair, and he frowned ever so slightly. Hearing a noise behind her, Eve turned around. The early morning sun had just risen, and its soft rays streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a faint glow around Ethan Parker. His naturally pale skin, now glistening with water, looked even more radiant and flawless. Even someone like Eve, who prided herself on avoiding indecent gazes, couldn't take her eyes off him. Feeling the gaze was too direct, Eve blushed, awkwardly turning her eyes away, glancing around as everything around her made her feel uncomfortable. Ethan Parker ignored her gaze and walked straight to the coffee table. When he didn't see the items on the table, his face darkened, and a faint anger flickered in his eyes. Still looking around nervously, Eve didn't notice his expression. Suddenly, Ethan Parker bent down, placing his hands on either side of her, hovering above her. It was only then that she realized the man was angry, and she instinctively pulled her head back. In a cold and arrogant tone, Ethan Parker demanded, "Where's the wallet?" His voice carried an undeniable authority. Eve rolled her eyes, calculating whether she should reveal the hidden items. Her hands, which had been resting on the sofa, slowly moved behind her back. Under Ethan Parker's icy glare, her hands started trembling. Even though she was scared, she stubbornly decided to stand her ground and, in a calm voice, replied, "I didn't see anything. I just woke up." "What wallet? You don't even know where your own stuff is?" Ethan Parker's dark eyes flickered. Eve noticed his hand rising off the sofa, and instinctively, she shielded her head, quickly blurting out, "You took advantage of me being drunk to bring me to this hotel, and now you want to hit me? You're done. I've already called the police. Get ready for jail." Ethan Parker's expression darkened like a deep abyss, and his hand, which had been hanging in mid-air, slowly lowered onto the back of the sofa behind Eve, trapping her between his body and the sofa. Leaning in closer, his voice carried a menacing tone, "You called the police on me?" Eve, flustered by his imposing presence, stammered out, I did. So what? All right, since you insist, I might as well comply. This way, we won't waste the police's time." Before Eve could process his words, Ethan Parker leaned in quickly. Terrified, Eve screamed, "No. Please don't touch me." Her eyes widened in fear as Ethan Parker's face drew closer, her hands shielding her chest. The bravery she had shown earlier completely vanished, and her voice trembled with tears. "Please, no. Don't." In her heart, she cursed her own mouth once again. Why couldn't she say something smarter to stall him until the police arrived? Seeing her look as if she was about to face execution, Ethan Parker found the situation amusing. He hadn't even touched her yet, but her expression was as if she had been constipated for days. Lowering himself closer, Eve immediately backed away. Just as their noses were about to touch, Ethan Parker reached behind the cushion and pulled out the wallet, waving it in front of Eve's face with a mocking look. As he was about to get up and leave, a loud bang echoed. The door was kicked open from the outside, followed by 7 or 8 men in police uniforms rushing in. Both Ethan Parker and Eve on the sofa turned to look at the door. Ethan Parker glanced at Eve, seeing a gleam of triumph in her tearful eyes. Before the police could ask any questions, Eve immediately tugged on Ethan Parker's towel, her face contorted in misery. "Officers, you finally arrived. If you had been a moment later, he would have used a gun on me. He was beating me just now. Thankfully, you came just in time." The more she cried, the more dramatic she became. Her heart raced with excitement, and she cried even harder, her tears streaming down like a delicate, sorrowful flower. Ethan Parker, watching the police storm in and recalling Eve's strange behavior earlier, immediately understood her intentions. He thought to himself, this woman really doesn't know her limits. Fine, if she wanted to play, he would play along. Ethan Parker slowly stood up, ignoring everyone around him. With a graceful gesture, he casually adjusted the bathrobe's belt that Eve had pulled loose. Meanwhile, the police officers who had just barged in were stunned by the scene before them. "Oh my God! Who is this?" This was none other than the famous CEO of Dingxing International, a regular in Jiangcharles's news. But what was happening here? Could there be some mistake in the intel? However, the situation didn't seem like a mistake. Ethan Parker noticed the hesitation in the police's movements and felt a hint of satisfaction. At least, they knew who they couldn't provoke. Meanwhile, Eve continued crying her heart out. Seeing the police officers just standing there, dumbfounded, Eve found the situation strange. Before she could take any further action, she noticed Ethan Parker squinting his eyes, his gaze cold and piercing. He bent down and lifted her chin slightly. "Ah, very good. I'll see you at the police station." Still in a daze and unsure of what to do, Eve quickly pointed at Ethan Parker. "Did you hear that? He's threatening me. Arrest him now. Are you all stupid or what?" At that moment, one of the police officers kindly approached Eve and said, "Are you the one who called the police? Please gather your things and come with us to the station. We need your cooperation." Ethan Parker let out a soft chuckle, ignoring Eve's outbursts. He casually walked over to the bed and searched for his phone. After finding it, he quickly dialed a number. "You have 10 minutes. We're heading to the police station now." Without waiting for a response, he hung up decisively. Turning to the still stunned officers, he lazily pointed at them. "I'm Ethan Parker. If there are any issues, my lawyer will handle them. Although his words sounded polite, the arrogance in his eyes was unmistakable. Eve finally realized that calling the police had been a foolish move. Clearly, these officers were just watching Ethan Parker handle the situation. Now what? Just then, a young police officer, looking like a college student, stepped forward. A young police officer rushed in, seeing the dried tear marks on Eve's face. With a sense of justice, he immediately blocked Ethan Parker as he was walking toward the bed. What do you think you're doing? The police are handling this case, you need to behave. The team leader quickly pulled him away, reprimanding him. Episode 8, don't you know who this is? You can't just charge in without understanding the situation. What did I bring you here for? Get back to your position. The leader then motioned to the other officers behind him to drag the young officer away. The young officer looked at the captain in disbelief, wanting to say something but was stopped by a sharp look from the captain. Get outside and wait. The captain hurriedly turned to Ethan Parker, bowing his head and apologizing. Sorry, Mr. Pei. He's new and doesn't know better. Please don't mind him. Ethan Parker glanced at the captain, gave a slight nod, and walked into the bathroom to change into the clean clothes brought by hotel staff. As for Eve, she was utterly dumbfounded by the turn of events. She thought to herself, wow, I never imagined it would turn out like this. Even the police are afraid of him. Where's the justice? But, what was his name again? Ethan Parker, right? Oh no, I'm in trouble now. When Ethan Parker stepped out after changing, his elegant demeanor made Eve feel slightly dazed. Are you sure you don't need to change your clothes? Or do you prefer to keep sitting like that? While the floor isn't cold, with your frail figure. Eve suddenly remembered to be mindful of her image. She was wearing a cocktail dress, yet she had been sitting casually on the floor and fake crying for so long. She could already hear some of the police officers whispering, most of them discussing her relationship with Ethan Parker, that detestable man. But she would never admit to having anything to do with him. Ethan Parker had also heard the murmurs from the surrounding officers, but so what? He was Ethan Parker, and he did whatever he wanted. He didn't care about their opinions. He made a small gesture to the police captain, signaling that they could depart. What Eve hadn't expected was that her plan had backfired. She was also told to accompany them to the police station to provide evidence and give a statement. But evidence? What evidence could she possibly have? When she woke up, she had carefully checked herself, and aside from her dress being thrown aside, there were no suspicious marks or pain on her body. If she had known the legal process would be this complicated, she would never have foolishly called the police. The police captain only nodded and didn't say much as he respectfully escorted Ethan Parker and Eve out of the hotel. At the police station, out of respect for Ethan Parker's status, the captain didn't dare interrogate him hastily and instead went to fetch the chief. Chief Charles, a rather portly man, heard that the person brought in had a significant background. After quickly familiarizing himself with the situation, he rushed over in a jog. Upon entering, he slightly bowed. Chief Charles was worried about offending a powerful figure. He didn't want to lose the position he had worked so hard to achieve due to an accidental offense. Ethan Parker glanced at Chief Charles as he hurried from his office, a deep thought flashing in his eyes. Charles found the man before him very familiar. Dressed in high-end brand suits, exuding an extraordinary aura, this man certainly didn't seem like someone in trouble. Captain Lily Chiao entered and quietly said to Chief Charles, "That's Ethan Parker, the CEO of Ethan International." Upon hearing that, Chief Charles's pupils contracted. How did they handle this case so poorly to involve such a high-profile figure? He thought to himself, it's easy to invite a deity but hard to send one away. Chief Charles only hoped Ethan Parker would be reasonable, otherwise, he might lose his position. The Captain Lily Chiao, with a knowing look, glanced at Ethan Parker and Eve, whispering to Chief Charles, "Chief, I think this woman probably has a deep relationship with Ethan Parker. Otherwise, given Parker's personality, she would have been put in her place by now. Chief Charles gave Captain Lily Qiao an approving smile and looked again at the atmosphere between the two. It did seem suspicious. He nodded, signaling for the Captain Lily Qiao to leave, as his presence was no longer needed. Meanwhile, Eve was glaring daggers at Ethan Parker, her eyes full of hatred, as if she wanted to tear him to pieces. Her fierce gaze was quite threatening, but Ethan Parker didn't seem to care. No matter how sharp her eyes were, he remained calm and composed, as if nothing was happening. Ethan Parker's nonchalance only fueled Eve's anger. She thought to herself, I must be the unluckiest person in the world to run into such a weirdo. Now it seemed clear that this man had significant influence. What should be done? Eve's large eyes were filled with anger. If it weren't for him, how would she be in this situation? Her lively, crystal-clear eyes locked onto Chief Charles, filled with resentment. Officer, you have to believe me, he really had bad intentions toward me, she said furiously, pointing at Ethan Parker. Chief Charles glanced over at Ethan Parker, sitting calmly, and then looked back at the anxious girl in front of him, feeling utterly at a loss. For these upper-class young men like Ethan Parker, it wasn't uncommon to have a few pretty young women around them. Especially nowadays, some girls were even eager to be noticed, hoping to marry into wealth and become a phoenix. Charles wondered if this girl was foolish or blind. Suddenly, a story of King Wen of Zhou playing tricks on his vassals with beacon fires flashed in Charles's mind. Perhaps Parker was just playing around too. The girl didn't seem to have any special background, but after all, they were in a hotel. Ethan Parker wasn't taking any drastic action either, so perhaps it was just a small matter. With that in mind, Chief Charles realized that offending this girl, Eve, might also not be a wise move. He spoke calmly to defuse the situation, Miss, please don't get too worked up. We will handle this fairly. For now, could you fill out this form? Once the gentleman's lawyer arrives, we will proceed with the next steps. There's no need to rush. I believe he has already contacted his lawyer, and they should be on their way. Please sit down and rest. Ethan Parker knew well that this pudgy man was getting nervous. But this woman had no background at all. It was hard to imagine how someone like him could have climbed to this position by merely trying to guess his superior's thoughts. After all, it was a misunderstanding, thinking she had some sort of connection with him. Otherwise, how could the situation have escalated to this point? Reflecting on it, if he forgave this woman so easily, who knew how arrogant she might become? Sooner or later, she'd ruin him. This woman was really stupid to the extreme. Ethan Parker smirked and said, Miss Eve, you really know how to joke. You think I had ill intentions toward you? Perhaps you've forgotten what you did last night. And besides, with a figure like yours. His words trailed off deliberately, achieving an unexpected effect. Eve's fair face turned as red as a boiled tomato. Last night? What happened last night? She remembered waking up in just her undergarments and seeing him step out of the bathroom. With her beauty like that of a goddess, how could any normal man not be tempted? Was everyone crazy? Did he really not desire her? Somehow, it felt worse than being assaulted. Could her appearance and body really be as bad as he said? Otherwise, why would Luke Quinn fall for someone else? Seeing Eve scratching her head in frustration, Ethan Parker couldn't help but chuckle. Miss Eve, it seems you've forgotten a lot. Who was at the wedding last night? Who got drunk and made a scene? Who clung to me and wouldn't let go? After his reminder, Eve suddenly realized. Yes, that's right. Last night was the wedding of Luke Quinn and Natalie Young, and she ended up getting drunk. Oh my God, what has she done? She might as well be struck by lightning now. Looking at Eve's expression, it seemed she had remembered something. But Ethan Parker was not someone to be easily provoked. This being his first time in a police station, all because of a misunderstanding like this, was just unbelievable. Eve finally remembered. This man was the president of Jingsheng International. No wonder the police didn't know how to handle the situation. But what on earth did she do? She even called the police, accusing him of assault. It made her want to hit her head against the wall. But now that things had come this far, how could she not continue? She had no idea how to fix this. Ethan Parker gave Eve a mocking glance and said, "Looks like your brain is working, you can still smile." His words carried a double meaning, hinting both that Eve had realized who he was, and what she had done the previous night. Chief Charles stood still like a statue, understanding the implication without taking direct action on the case. Anyone who could become the chief wasn't an ordinary person. Apart from Eve and the guards at the door, everyone else was clueless about what was happening. Receiving Ethan Parker's signal, Chief Charles let out a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Eve was panicking, stomping her feet and fumbling with her phone, unsure of what to do. It turns out this man has a very deep background, and she was foolish enough to want him to face some punishment. Damn, he even called a lawyer. This realization left Eve dumbfounded. He can't be serious, right? It shouldn't be like that, after all, I'm a woman. He should have at least some gentlemanly manners, right? Ethan Parker looked at Eve with contempt as she stood there stunned. Now she knows she was wrong. Too late. But where the hell is Michael Lin? Why hasn't he shown up yet? What is he dragging his feet about? Ethan Parker didn't say much, but the cold air around him grew even colder. Nobody said a word, they just stared at each other. Ethan Parker cursed Michael Lin internally, while Eve cursed herself. Ever since meeting this woman, nothing good had come her way. Now she was stuck here with this madman at the police station. Why hadn't she just let her make a fool of herself last night instead? The small office in the police station became eerily silent. A young officer with a rather innocent-looking face walked in and said to Chief Charles, "Chief, Mr. Pei's lawyer has arrived." Chief Charles nodded quickly, yes, please bring him. I mean, invite him in." Eve curiously leaned forward, wondering who would be coming. About 3 minutes later, Michael Lin finally showed up, fashionably late after being called for so many times. Though he was a lawyer, and a prominent one in the legal world, his flamboyant personality was just as well known to the people of Jiangcharlsk. No way, it's actually Michael Lin. In Jiangcharlsk, everyone knows him. I really don't understand who I offended to deserve this. It's all because of that damn man. If he hadn't meddled in my business, would I be in this situation? But, will he really do anything? After all, it doesn't seem like he was actually assaulted. Chief Charles was about to say something when he saw Michael Lin completely ignore his gaze and walk straight towards Ethan Parker. "Oh, I can't believe you're in trouble today. What have you done to need me?" As Michael Lin approached, Eve felt a deep sense of helplessness. She knew she was doomed. It seemed like this man was very familiar with him, and that was not a good realization. What should she do now? Ethan Parker looked at Michael Lin, coldly saying, "Were you at home giving birth to monkeys?" Michael Lin casually replied, "As soon as I got your call, I came. No time for monkeys." Eve watched the way the two interacted, feeling speechless but mostly concerned about her own fate. Ethan Parker glanced at Eve, noticing her expressions from the moment Michael Lin appeared until now. He found it amusing but didn't show it. Slowly raising his gaze, he said coldly, "Are you blind? Can't you see? And why isn't your mouth working?" Michael Lin let out a few mischievous laughs, not responding to the jibe, and turned to size up Eve before teasing Ethan Parker. Could this be the beautiful woman from last night's rumor, the one who even made our Master Pei captivated? It hasn't been that long since we last contacted each other, and your taste seems to have improved quite a bit. Ethan Parker's eyes lit up with traces of anger, along with the annoyance caused by Eve, all directed towards Michael Lin. "Did I call you here to watch a show?" Michael Lin shrugged carelessly and replied with a smile, "I know, don't be like that, it's just a joke." After speaking, he stood more seriously next to Ethan Parker, pulled out his lawyer's business card, and calmly said, "Hello, officer, I am Ethan Parker's lawyer. I'd like to know why my client is here. I expect a reasonable explanation, otherwise, I will pursue legal action." Chief Charles wiped the sweat from his forehead, realizing that dealing with someone of this caliber wasn't as easy as it seemed. He cautiously spoke, This morning at 10 o'clock, we received a report from a young lady, Eve, who claimed that someone attempted to assault her. When our officers arrived at the scene, the situation was chaotic, with the young lady's clothing torn and the room in disarray. Michael Lin immediately seized the opportunity, pressing further, "So, officer, did my client commit the alleged assault?" Chief Charles felt immense pressure. Dealing with such influential people was truly overwhelming. He quickly explained, "At that time, Ethan Parker was only wrapped in a towel, so we brought him in for further investigation." However, Ethan Parker was unwilling to cooperate. "They required you to be present to agree to further investigation." Episode 9. The remaining matters were easily resolved. By now, Ethan Parker was hungry and signaled for Michael Lin to wrap things up. Michael Lin stepped forward to negotiate with Chief Charles, who understood the implications and quickly agreed, announcing that Ethan Parker was free to leave. Chief Charles was secretly relieved that the situation hadn't escalated, glad he hadn't offended Ethan Parker, or things would have gone badly. Eve noticed that after Michael Lin spoke, the police's attitude changed completely. Her internal anger flared up again, but she had no choice but to swallow her frustration. A look of unwillingness flashed across Eve's face, but given Ethan Parker's status, she really didn't want to stir up any more trouble. However, Ethan Parker had no intention of letting this crazy woman off so easily. He sat lazily in his chair, his dark eyes watching Eve intently, his words low as he questioned Chief Charles, "So, it's all settled?" Chief Charles wiped away the beads of sweat on his forehead, nearly bowing as he responded, "Yes, it is." Ethan Parker then walked up to Eve, leaned in, and whispered in her ear, "Still not satisfied? Then let me make sure you hate me forever." With that, he stood up, gave Michael Lin a glance full of disdain, and left. Michael Lin knew that the woman was in for more trouble. Really, of all people, why provoke Ethan Parker? Michael Lin silently prayed for Eve. As expected, Ethan Parker spoke to the officer, "Chief Charles, right? I'm fine now, and I can leave, correct?" Chief Charles quickly responded, Yes, Mr. Pei, that's correct." Ethan Parker said calmly, "Since it's proven I'm innocent, I have some matters to attend to now." After saying this, his gaze locked onto Eve. Eve felt a growing sense of foreboding as she saw his dark eyes. Could he really be planning to get revenge on her? But she still refused to back down and glared at Ethan Parker. Chief Charles, hearing Ethan Parker's words, eagerly responded, "Mr. Pei, if there's anything you need, just say the word. How can we assist you?" Seeing Chief Charles's ingratiating expression, Eve mentally gave him a bad review. What kind of chief was this, acting so disgracefully? Ethan Parker slowly said, "I was wrongfully accused. And being wronged is not a pleasant experience." Then, turning to Eve with a cold smile, he said, "Michael Lin, isn't this situation considered defamation?" Michael Lin nodded in agreement, a smirk on his face as if to remind Eve, "Miss, you're in trouble now in this king's hands." Eve cursed under her breath, "Shit. This guy is too much." She ground her teeth in frustration, thinking, all my prayers didn't work. How can he be so petty? I really want to peel his skin and drink his blood. Too much. Seeing Eve gritting her teeth in anger, Ethan Parker's earlier annoyance disappeared significantly, and a wicked smile curved on his lips as he said to Eve, "Humph, now you realize you were wrong, huh?" Eve couldn't hold it in anymore. Would she just watch this man leave so arrogantly? She couldn't help but shout, "You're such a petty man. Don't be too cocky. Just wait, when I get out, I won't let you off." Hearing Eve's threat, Ethan Parker stopped in his tracks, a playful look in his eyes as he gazed at her. That look made Eve feel like a little rabbit facing a big gray wolf, and she instinctively took a step back. As she sat in her chair, Ethan Parker deliberately leaned in closer, so close that they could both clearly smell each other's scent. He placed his hand on the back of her chair, trapping her in a very small space. Eve sat up straight, holding her breath. She could feel Ethan Parker's breath near her. Seeing Eve so nervous, Ethan Parker was very satisfied and said, "You want me to wait for you? Then I'll wait for you to come out, climb onto my bed, and give me children." "Oh, so you're really that eager for me to rape you, huh? Scoundrel. Low-life scoundrel." Eve screamed inwardly and immediately tried to fight back, but as soon as she lifted her hand, Ethan Parker grabbed it, continuing, "Then I'll just wait for you to go to jail. Wait until you turn into an old lady, then come find me." Michael Lynn was completely stunned by this, unable to resist interjecting, "Hey, buddy, isn't that like a lifelong promise?" Although Ethan Parker's words made Eve extremely angry, they also made her realize the situation. She had offended someone powerful and was still sitting here, unsure of what to do. Feeling like a defeated fighter, she lowered her head. Seeing her in this state, Ethan Parker felt an inexplicable discomfort. He turned to Michael Lynn, took his business card, and threw it to Eve, saying, "I suggest you carefully think through everything. Is a man like him worth it for you, a foolish woman, to get drunk over? How stupid. When you figure it out, come find me anytime. I'm not joking." With that, he walked away decisively. Michael Lynn looked at Eve, who was still standing there clueless, and reminded her, "He's given you his business card, use it wisely. If anything comes up, just call me." Eve grabbed the business card, tore it in half, then into 4 pieces, threw it on the ground, and muttered, "Damn it, who would come looking for you?" Looking at the torn pieces on the ground, still feeling unsatisfied, she stomped on them a few times and sat back down. After a long while, with no one paying her any attention, she picked up the business card pieces and kept tearing them. When they were shredded beyond recognition, she smiled with satisfaction and said, "Humph, I may not be able to take you down, but I can sure tear your business card apart. Idiot." Chief Charles, after sending off Ethan Parker, walked back in and was surprised to see the pieces of the business card scattered on the ground. He thought to himself, even I don't have the guts to ask for Ethan Parker's card, and yet this woman just tore it up. Interesting. Showing no signs of respect, Chief Charles cleared his throat twice to grab Eve's attention and calmly said, "Miss Eve, calm down." Seeing him, Eve immediately burst out, directing all her anger toward him. She slammed the table and shouted, "How disgraceful. You're the chief and yet you cling to the powerful. Do you have any sense of ethics left? You just stand there, letting him bully me without saying a word of justice." Though she knew she was blowing things out of proportion, the fire inside her couldn't find an outlet. Chief Charles, now that Ethan Parker had left, did a complete 180 in his attitude. He sneered at Eve and said, "Miss Eve, who do you think you're talking to? Don't be so arrogant. You think you're the biggest just because you know Ethan Parker? Who do you think you are? Just a small citizen, and you dare lash out at me? Humph, now I officially announce that you'll be detained for 15 days for defamation." Earlier, Lawyer Donovan had reminded him to just scare the girl a bit, but with what she'd done today, he could have easily had her locked up for a few months. The word "detained" sent a shiver down Eve's spine, her face turning pale as paper. Was there no justice left? The victim gets jailed while the culprit roams free. In reality, 15 days of detention wasn't that big a deal, but she was afraid that her mother would be heartbroken and suffer because of it. Seeing the fear in Eve's expression, Chief Charles nodded in satisfaction and added, "Or call someone to bail you out." Eve's dull eyes instantly brightened, and she nodded repeatedly, afraid Chief Charles might change his mind. Okay, I'll make the call right now. Her mother was just an ordinary woman, never having dealt with big issues. She spent her days cautiously, diligently working between the market and home. Just hearing the word, police, would make her think it was something very serious, and it would definitely scare her. Eve didn't want to worry her mother, so she hesitated for a moment and decided to call Emily Palmer. Although she always felt bad about troubling Emily, she thought she could repay the favor by helping out at her shop more often. What? Why are you there? Emily Palmer's shocked voice came through the receiver. Don't even mention it. It's all because of that guy I hired the other day. Such a petty man. Eve grumbled. Just get me out first, and I'll tell you the rest. She wanted to vent a bit more, but seeing the strange looks from the policeman when she insulted the jerk, she figured it was better to keep quiet. Getting out of here was the priority. She had really had enough of Chief Charles's sudden mood changes, and the phrase, under someone else's roof, you have to lower your head, fit her perfectly at the moment. Without hesitation, Emily Palmer agreed. All right, wait there. I'll be right over. She trusted her best friend deeply, convinced that if Eve was in trouble, it was definitely because someone set her up. If not, well, it might just be Eve's own doing. But thinking about it more, it was likely that Eve had gotten herself into trouble. Phew. What am I saying? I shouldn't think like that. Good people deserve good things. Eve vowed never to return to that place again. After finishing the call, she sat there waiting, bored, for Emily Palmer to come and rescue her from this nightmare. Watching Chief Charles, who was rather fat, staring at her made her feel disgusted. I'm not going anywhere. Why keep staring at me? So annoying. Eve sat thinking about everything. He told me to think carefully about what happened. Yeah, how did I end up in a room with him? I think I drank too much yesterday. Yeah, I drank too much. Then someone was holding me, and I threw up. Yeah, I threw up all over him. I can't remember anything after that. As she was lost in her thoughts, a loud and familiar voice echoed, Chief Charles, why are you here? Is there a big case? Nothing important, Chief Charles smiled slyly, glancing at Eve to shift the topic. You've just returned, must be tired. Sit down, have some water and rest. It was well known that Michael Lynn was an impressive officer. Without his achievements, it would have taken Henry Charles years to rise to the rank of chief. Thank you for your concern, Chief Charles. Michael Lynn's strong voice woke Eve from her thoughts. Their eyes met. Eve, what are you doing here? Michael Lynn asked in surprise. Chief Charles blinked in confusion. You two know each other. Eve stood up, smiling awkwardly in greeting. Hi Michael Lynn, what a coincidence. Michael Lynn was Luke Quinn's friend, so naturally, he and Eve knew each other as well. Eve was about to say something else, but Michael Lynn quickly realized that the seat Eve was in was the suspect's chair. He immediately turned to Chief Charles and asked, what's going on here? Is she being accused of filing a false report and defamation? Chief Charles replied calmly, yes. False report and defamation charges. What Eve had feared came sooner than expected. This would probably reach Luke Quinn's ears soon. In her heart, Eve once again cursed the ancestors of Ethan Park for 18 generations. Michael Lynn's gaze shifted to Eve. Seeing her pitiful expression, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow and awkwardly said, Chief Charles, I think she realizes her mistake. Why don't I stand as her guarantor and let her go home first? Yes. I've realized my mistake. I regret it. I promise I won't make the same mistake again, Eve said sincerely, her eyes full of earnestness. Chief Charles frowned, pretending to hesitate as if pondering. But to Eve, it seemed like Chief Charles wasn't going to give Michael Lynn face. She thought angrily, this fat guy still refuses to let her go, even though he said she could leave with someone vouching for her. Chief Charles, didn't you say someone could guarantee my release? Officer Lynn is my friend. If he's vouching for me, is there a problem? No problem, right? Then just let me go. Though Eve was using a question, her tone conveyed impatience and an underlying challenge, leaving both Chief Charles and Michael Lynn amused. In the end, with Michael Lynn's guarantee and Eve's good attitude, she was released. Only then was Eve allowed to leave. Next was the procedure for securing her bail. Eve sincerely thanked Michael Lynn. Thank you, Michael Lynn. Michael Lynn smiled, comforting her with a bright expression. No need to thank me, it was nothing. After all, we're friends. Michael Lynn's reassuring smile eased the complex emotions swirling inside Eve. Let me take you home, Michael Lynn offered. No, no need. It'd be too much trouble to have the police drive me home in a police car, Eve quickly refused. She knew if her mother saw that she hadn't come home last night, things would get even worse. Michael Lynn didn't insist. He checked his watch and said, how about we grab breakfast together? Not wanting to refuse again, Eve nodded in agreement. The two walked side by side across the street. Eve mulled over something, hesitating several times before finally summoning the courage to ask, Michael Lynn, could you keep what happened today a secret? Before she could finish her sentence, a voice called out from behind, Eve. She turned around to see Emily Palmer running toward her, looking flustered. When it came to Emily Palmer, Eve really didn't know whether to hate her or love her. At this moment, her feelings were a mix of love and hate, with tears on the verge. You left without waiting for me, made me run all the way here. Are you playing with me? Emily Palmer placed her hands on her hips, panting as she scolded. Eve was speechless. Michael Lynn, standing beside her, replied on her behalf, Hello, I'm Michael Lynn, Eve's friend. Emily Palmer widened her eyes, staring directly at Michael Lynn. A handsome, polite, and compassionate guy, such a rare find. She hurriedly extended her hand, Hello, I'm Maylee. Inside, she was fiercely scolding Eve for keeping such a handsome guy hidden and not introducing him to her sooner. Michael Lynn, I'll head back with Maylee now. I'll treat you to a meal another time, Eve quickly said, realizing Emily Palmer's impure intentions and trying to excuse herself to avoid causing more trouble. All right, Michael Lynn smiled, but before he could reply, Emily Palmer interrupted with a stern tone, scolding Eve, Is this how you repay someone? Then, turning to Michael Lynn, her face softened into a charming smile, Officer Lynn, since you've helped us so much, it's only fair that we treat you to a meal, right? I'm sure you won't refuse. Eve was truly amazed by Emily Palmer's ability to persuade anyone. With no way to refuse, the three of them found a nearby restaurant. As they ate and chatted, they accidentally discovered that Michael Lynn was actually Eve's senior from the same school, 2 years ahead of her. So doesn't that mean you know Luke Quinn? Emily Palmer blurted out, but halfway through her sentence, she realized it could touch a sore spot for Eve, and quickly swallowed the rest of her words. Michael Lynn smiled slightly and continued Emily Palmer's sentence, I was on the same school team as Elu. Michael Lynn's words made Eve unconsciously recall the beautiful memories of her school days. Every time they practiced or played a match, even if she had to skip class, she would always be there to cheer them on. Back then, they were recognized as the perfect couple in school. At that time, she was so focused on Luke Quinn, blindly thinking that he was the only one that mattered. Because of that, during her 4 years at university, she barely made any male friends. Most of the ones she knew were Luke Quinn's friends, including Michael Lynn. Suddenly, Eve wanted to cry again. She had once cared so much for one person, only to realize after losing him that she had almost nothing left. If Luke Quinn had never truly cared for her, maybe he never even saw her as a friend, then why should she continue like this? The world is so big, and surely there is someone out there who will treat her well, someone she really wants. But why does she still feel like crying? No, crying won't help. Eve, if you cry now, you're crying for him, and it's not worth it. Everything is in the past now. Tomorrow will be a new day, and it will be better than today. At least now, she has realized what she's lost, what she's overlooked, and what she needs to hold on to. After the meal, Emily Palmer reluctantly said goodbye to Michael Lynn. Eve declined Emily Palmer's invitation, saying she had to go home and check in. In reality, she wanted to take a walk along the river to digest her thoughts and reflect. This unrequited crush left Eve feeling a deep sense of loss. Jiang City is called such because from ancient times to the present, a branch of the Yangtze River has run through the entire city. This branch of the river was historically called Qi River. South of Qi River is the wealthy district of Jiang City, while to the north lies the poorer area and Balan district. Further north is the suburban area, and beyond the suburbs is a scenic tourist development zone. At that moment, Eve was strolling along the Qi River Bridge, admiring the endless scenery. Suddenly, she heard someone nearby shouting, "Robbery! Stop the thief!" Immediately, a figure dashed past her from behind on her right. Without thinking, Eve leaped forward and chased after the thief for about 20 meters. Just as the thief was within reach, Eve grabbed his arm with her left hand, using a clever lock move. Had the thief not cried out for mercy, Eve would have slammed him down with a shoulder throw, likely knocking him out. "Sister, please, have mercy on me. It's not easy doing this job. My mother is in her 50s, my son just turned 1, and my wife is waiting for me to come home for dinner. Please, I beg you," the thief pleaded. Eve chuckled. After a day of gloomy emotions, she suddenly felt a wave of satisfaction. She laughed out loud and patted the thief's shoulder. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today. Otherwise, with one move, you'd be in the hospital. Now, let's wait for the police to come pick us up." The crowd around them cheered in approval. "Good job, young lady. We're lucky to have you." A middle-aged woman, slightly out of breath, walked up to Eve. Just as Eve was about to talk to the middle-aged woman, the thief suddenly rolled his eyes, taking advantage of Eve's distraction, and forcefully broke free from her restraint, delivering a kick and then sprinting away. The crowd that had gathered around Eve upon seeing the thief being caught quickly stepped aside, afraid of being affected as the thief ran in their direction. Eve immediately sensed something was wrong. She swiftly dodged the kick, though she didn't fall, but the thief had seized the opportunity to escape. The middle-aged woman, seeing this, furiously pointed at the fleeing thief and shouted, "Stop right there. Someone, please help me catch that thief." However, by the time the woman finished yelling, the thief had already disappeared into the crowd. Frustrated, the middle-aged woman turned towards Eve and began to scold her, "You were supposed to do a good deed, so why didn't you finish it properly? Everything valuable I own is in there. It's all your fault for not holding him tight enough and letting him get away." Eve couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had clearly just wanted to help, and if the woman hadn't interrupted and distracted her, the thief wouldn't have had the chance to escape. How absurd, how could someone be so unreasonable? Feeling frustrated, Eve didn't want to argue further. She gave the woman a sideways glance, turned, and walked away, deciding not to engage with such unreasonable behavior. But to her surprise, the middle-aged woman wasn't about to let Eve walk away that easily. Immediately, the middle-aged woman grabbed Eve's hand, crying and refusing to let her leave. Eve felt disgusted and was about to say something when a familiar voice gradually approached, "Stop it. Don't be unreasonable." The middle-aged woman turned and shouted angrily, "Who are you calling unreasonable? Mind your own business." But when she saw the man with the thief whose hands were cuffed behind him, her voice trailed off. The man was none other than Ethan Parker. It turned out that after leaving the police station, Ethan Parker didn't immediately ask Michael Lynn to drive him home. Even he himself didn't know why he couldn't stop worrying about this woman who had repeatedly caused him trouble. Ethan Parker had been watching from a distance like an observer, seeing Eve's friend come to pick her up, watching her go out for a meal with that helpful policeman, watching them laugh and talk together. How did Ethan Parker end up like this, he wondered. But who cared? He was Ethan Parker, and if he wanted to do something, no one could stop him. And that's how he witnessed this intriguing scene. It seemed that this woman still had many things worth exploring. The thief was, of course, caught by Michael Lynn. People like Ethan Parker, how could they not know some self-defense skills? Eve was confused. Why are you here? She felt puzzled, though not entirely surprised. Wasn't this the man who had smugly left earlier, planning to take revenge and have her jailed? Humph, now he shows up again. What does he want this time? Don't think that saving her would make her forgive his past actions. What's wrong with me? If it weren't for me, how would you deal with this situation today? Ethan Parker said with a mischievous tone, his eyes scanning the surrounding crowd. At this moment, everyone was drawn to the sight of the two handsome men. After all, who doesn't love a good-looking man? Eve looked at the crowd and just wanted to leave immediately. The middle-aged woman, seeing Ethan Parker speak, quickly put on a charming, captivating smile and approached him. Handsome guy, what's your name? You caught the thief for me, thank you so much. Ethan Parker smirked slightly, stepped back a bit, and nodded without saying anything. He wasn't about to get himself tangled up in this. It was time for Michael Lynn to step in. He wasn't stupid enough to volunteer himself for the trouble. Sure enough, seeing Ethan Parker remain silent, Michael Lynn immediately stepped forward to converse with the middle-aged woman. Yes, ma'am, you better watch your wallet more carefully next time. Luckily, we caught the thief this time, or else that young lady might have had a big problem, right? The middle-aged woman chuckled awkwardly without saying anything and walked over to the thief to retrieve her wallet. She cursed at him one last time before leaving. As she walked away, she flirtatiously smiled at Michael Lynn and asked, "What's your name?" Eve wanted to rush up and beat the thief herself, but with so many people around, she held back. The thief grabbed her sleeve and pleaded, "Miss, please stop hitting me. I beg you, please." Eve noticed the growing crowd around her, pointing and whispering. Just as she was about to vent her frustration, she heard another voice. "Oh, woman, your skills aren't bad, are they?" Ethan Parker teased, and Eve cursed in her heart, "God, are you playing with me? I've been trying to ignore him, and now he's back again." Despite this, Eve felt embarrassed and lifted her head to glance at Ethan Parker. After all, he had helped her out of a sticky situation. Otherwise, who knew how much longer the middle-aged woman would have bothered her? After thinking for a moment, Eve finally spoke, Thank you for your help. Goodbye, you can go on with your day, no need to mind me." Ethan Parker originally wanted to say something, but seeing Eve's indifferent attitude, as if she had no desire to see him again and was being dismissive, he decided not to say anything. Without a word, he turned and left. As for Ethan Parker's mood, the cold air surrounding him made it clear how upset he was. Sitting in the car, Ethan Parker remained silent, staring at Michael Lynn as he drove, deep in thought about the past 2 days. The coldness radiating from him grew even more intense. If it weren't for that person, he wouldn't have had to spend so much time at the police station. It was all Michael Lynn's fault, and on top of that, that guy had seen him in such a vulnerable position. Sensing the icy atmosphere from Ethan Parker, Michael Lynn responded with an innocent smile. The atmosphere in the car felt frozen. Michael Lynn decided not to provoke Ethan Parker any further. He knew how scheming and ruthless Ethan Parker could be, and he had no intention of becoming collateral damage today. Soon enough, the car arrived at Ethan Parker's house. Why need Eva Phi Contam Ethan Parker, Chindilu, Tandilut Luke Quinn Lucas Quinn Juna Natalie Young Natalia Hoven Fan Milo Emily Palmer Amelia Palmero Lam Mock Michael Lynn Miguel Lin Dong Kai Jake Donovan Jamie Donato Cuc Truong Tran Director Charles Director Carlos D Tan Aunt Linda Tia Linda Thienbach to Sophia White Sophia Blanco Zhou Jipping Chu Te Ben James Zhou Jamie Zapata Lam Dai Nok Lin Dayu Chung Han Luong Wallace Chung Wallace Chung Lu Kai Lu Chin Kevin Lu Kevin Leon Dai Tru Big Pillar Grand Pilar Phi Thien Nai Pei Tianya Skylar Parker Cielo Parker Caption Xiao Chiao Lily Chiao Liliana Chiao Chen Hui Henry Chen Enrique Chen